February the 13th, 1966, Krakow, Poland. Children were out sledging, but 19-year-old Karol Kot was looking for a very different kind of thrill.
This is somebody who chose to do evil. He knew the difference between right and wrong, and yet he chose to harm others anyway.
Kot spotted an 11-year-old boy walking alone and approached him.
Press called him a vampire and a beast. People were really, really afraid.
Spurred by an insatiable lust for blood, Kot grabbed the boy and drove his bayonet into the child's chest repeatedly. He stabbed the boy 11 times, puncturing every vital organ.
Kot killed as a schoolboy at the age of 21. He had already stood trial for 2 counts of murder, 10 counts of attempted murder.
The perverse pleasure he derived from harming the most vulnerable of victims makes Karol Kot one of the world's most evil killers. Krakow, southern Poland. Beginning in 1964, a young man called Karol Kot developed a lust for blood that earned him the moniker the Vampire of Krakow. He would terrify the city for the next 2 years.
Kot was, without question, one of the world's most evil killers, not least because he killed all his victims while effectively a schoolboy.
He was completely lacking in remorse, and he was so young. To completely lack a conscience, to be a kind of fully formed killer before he's even age 20 is really shocking.
Still at school, Karol Kot had killed 2 people, an 11-year-old boy at a sledging competition and an 86-year-old woman as she prayed. Kot had attempted to kill at least a dozen more. Fascinated by the sinister story, Marta wrote a book on Kot.
Women were afraid to go out to church anymore. If they were going to church, some of them were putting like some metal balls or other objects like pillows, attaching them to their backs so they can protect themselves.
Coroner Tomasz Konopka closely studied the Karol Kot case.
Only 2 people died as a result of Karol Kot's activity, but the way he killed, his approach towards murder was unique. Killing gave him pleasure.
One of the characteristics of Karol Kot was that after he would kill, he took great pleasure in licking the knife and tasting the blood. This aspect of the vampirism is something that has made his crimes sufficiently unique.
This killer's story begins a little over 70 years ago. Karol Kot was born in Krakow in southern Poland on December the 18th, 1946, to a middle-class family. On the surface, their home life seemed happy and healthy.
His father worked as an engineer, his mother was a stay-at-home mum, and they were quite a respectable family.
It was like a good, loving family. His mother didn't work, especially for him, so he didn't have to go to preschool. And he was raised in a Jewish quarter of Krakow.
But when Karol Kot was 8 years old, his sister was born.
I think that really did unsettle him quite a lot, because he's been used to being the centre of attention for 8 years. He feels that she's the favoured one. And whether or not that's true, often when we look at dynamics in families, it's not what parents are doing or not doing, it's how children are perceiving that. So I think he felt pushed out, I think he felt slighted right from the beginning.
Later, Karol Kot said that his parents loved her more than him. He said that's why he abused her. He tried to introduce military order at home.
I think Kot's relationship with his sister is a warning sign. And this was the beginning, I think, of a process for Kot, a process of expressing himself in a dysfunctional way when things weren't going as he wanted them to go. And it's one that escalates slowly over time.
Another sign that all was not well with the boy was his cruelty to animals.
They had 2 cats in the house, and he was like treating cats badly. He was throwing them at the walls, things like that.
Often when we look back at the childhoods of serial killers, we see some form of harm, some form of abuse towards animals. And this is something that individuals do to maintain some control, because they have feelings of trauma, of anxiety, of basically feeling slighted, of feeling left out.
On family holidays to the village of Pachim, 30 miles south of Krakow, Kot developed an unnatural passion.
He developed a fascination with slaughterhouses. On holiday, he would go with his parents and ask to go to the slaughterhouse. Now, this is quite unusual in a young man of 10, 11, 12.
That's when he understood that he loves blood. He's fascinating with blood. He was talking about it like he noticed that blood is still warm. It was alive just a moment ago, and that it was something very special for him.
One of the most extraordinary incidents when he was in the slaughterhouse was that the slaughtermen drained blood into a cup and passed it to him for him to drink. They thought this boy would simply freak out. He did exactly the opposite. He drank the blood, which in turn freaked them out.
Here's a child who goes on family holidays to the countryside, and what do normal children do? What are they interested in? They're interested in playing, running through the woods, maybe picking flowers, right? Swimming if it's possible. What does Karol Kot want to do? He wants to slice up an animal, and he wants to drink the animal's blood, and he wants to do it in front of people, and he wants them to be entertained by it or amazed by it. This is extraordinarily rare behavior.
At the same time, young Karol Kot developed a disturbing fetish.
He said that knife was like his biggest love he can think of. He was admiring knives. He actually can speak in surprisingly sophisticated language about knives.
Kot's rare obsession would soon prove deadly.
This is a weapon. This is something that he can use to threaten other people. And carrying a knife makes him feel important. It makes him feel powerful.
Later he started to thinking, how does it feel to put knife into a human body? But he didn't have the courage. So he started to hurting small animals at first. And he noticed that blood affects him. It makes him excited.
While at school, Kot joined a target shooting club where he met a girl, Danusha, that he soon became obsessed with. She was 6 years older than Karol.
They became like friends, but from his side, I think this relationship looked a bit different. I think she treated him as a friend and he was in love.
It wouldn't surprise me if this relationship wasn't one of equals, because I think here we've got a young lad who has difficulty relating to other people. He doesn't have those social skills.
In a twisted bid to impress Danusha, Kot revealed to her some of his sadistic fantasies and cruel acts he had committed.
I suspect she finds him cute. She's sure the stories are untrue or made up, but she's just not excited by them. And in some ways, that's exactly what Kot needs. He needs somebody who can hear his craziness, who he can brag to, who he can storytell to, who he can relive with, and not have them screaming bloody murder.
On a shooting club outing, the young Kot could not contain his violent urges.
After having told her that he's this person, he attempts to prove it to her by attacking her and even starting to strangle her.
He attacked her. He pulled out a piece of broken glass from his pocket. He told her he wanted to cut her wrists and throw her into the river so it would look like a suicide.
This is basically his frustrations because he can't get what he wants. And the only way that he knows to get what he wants, based on his past experience, is to be violent, is to be abusive, is to be manipulative. But it doesn't quite work with Danusha.
She responds in a very interesting way. She laughs. She doesn't take it seriously. And tells him, in essence, well, you know, everyone knows that we're together today, so if you kill me, you'll definitely be caught. And he stops. What you have to be impressed with is the woman herself, because her momentary psychological sophistication probably saved her life.
But on September the 21st, 1964, the 17-year-old schoolboy felt compelled to attack a stranger for the first time.
Karol Kot was describing that day. The urge of killing was so incredible that he just couldn't calm down, and he started to walk across the town with a knife. And then he thought that he will search for some lonely woman in a church. And he went to one of the churches and he was waiting.
Kot later said he was about to leave when 48-year-old Helena entered a church in the center of the city to pray.
He took out a German military bayonet from the sheath and he stabbed her in the back.
He stabbed her just like once in her back, trying to reach the heart from the back.
When someone is stabbed, they will describe feeling as if they've been punched. You don't necessarily get that sharp feeling you might imagine. And that would be a surprise, it would be a shock, it would be unpleasant.
It's only when there's blood coming out that they realise what's going on. So in the moments in this blitz attack, I think perhaps this victim didn't really understand what was going on.
Remarkably, the 48-year-old woman survived.
To stab someone to the back, you are primarily looking at damage to the heart, damage to the lungs, and that certainly can be lethal, but it's not usually instantly fatal.
The woman didn't realize that this had happened. She probably didn't feel any pain. It was only after she left that she realized, when she went to a shop and someone told her that her clothes were blood-stained.
The interesting thing about the first attack is it shows you how naive he is. His stabbing behavior doesn't have a chance of killing anyone. He doesn't understand really how you kill somebody, right? So it's like he's exploring it. It's like he rushes in, he stabs, he waits for something to happen. He thinks magic's gonna happen. Blood's gonna be everywhere and he's gonna have a dead body.
But the schoolboy's bloody intent was far from blunted.
So here we've got this individual who associates power and status with harm, and whether or not his victims die, that's probably not something he really cares about.
Krakow, Poland, September the 23rd, 1964. Just 2 days after his first attack, 17-year-old Karol Kot was on the prowl again. His next target was an elderly woman chosen at random.
The second attack happened only 2 days later, and I think this illustrates how much he enjoyed the first attack and how much he wanted to continue the high that had come along with that.
In my mind, I think he was painting his own picture, the life of Karol Kot. He was fulfilling, blossoming, if you like, into a fully fledged killer. I think he set himself that dream. The butterfly was emerging from the chrysalis.
Kot wanted to kill again, but still a schoolboy, the young man needed a victim who wouldn't fight back.
One characteristic that connects all the incidents was that he attacked single people. Single, meaning there were no witnesses.
I think the choice of victims here is no accident whatsoever. We know that elderly people and elderly women in particular are one of the target groups for serial killers because they are physically weaker, they are often on their own, and that vulnerability makes it easy to target them and to take their lives.
Cott's next victim was a 78-year-old woman called Francesca. He spotted her getting off a tram. When she entered the apartment building, Cott attacked.
Cott stabbed her, again in the back. This time, she felt the pain more quickly. But equally, Cott disappeared.
Francesca did indeed survive the attack, but she never recovered from her wounds.
The stabbings pierced her backbone, and she had problems walking for the rest of her life.
I think that Cott, with all of his victims, he was trying to kill them, but he wasn't willing to hang around long enough to make sure of it. He was trying to escape.
The news of the shocking attacks rattled the citizens of Krakow, but that only served to embolden 17-year-old Karol Cott.
There would have been a bit of a buzz, a bit of a fear in the community around them. And to know that he's created this is something that he's going to be really enjoying. So he will be escalating his offending. It is going to be more violent, more serious, more prolonged.
Just 6 days later, on September the 29th, 1964, Cott spotted an elderly woman near a nunnery in Krakow. Armed with his bayonet, he followed her into the nunnery.
She's also stabbed from behind, but this one seems to have been more ferocious, given that he's driven the knife into her with much more ferocity, much more force. Never in a million years would you think that somebody has just randomly come and stabbed you. So it would have been incredibly shocking.
This time, his victim, 86-year-old Maria, died, but not before she managed to say a few last words to the nun who found her.
The nun said that when she got close to her, she was laying on the floor, breathing heavily, and she said just 2 words, "Young boy."
Today, one of Poland's leading coroners, Thomas Konopka, works at the same hospital where Maria's post-mortem was carried out.
The post-mortem examination was conducted here, in this autopsy room. The examination showed that the wound was not deep. The wound went through the back, through the muscles, and ended in the backbone. The conclusion was that because of the pain and shock related to the stabbing in the back, her heart gave out and she died.
The senseless murder committed by a schoolboy was headline news across Poland.
Panic broke out in Krakow. People were afraid of going out in the evenings, especially women. People were warned not to go out alone, not to go alone to the church.
I think it was very difficult for the inhabitants of Krakow to comprehend that a boy could be responsible. The first reaction was disbelief. The second reaction was fear.
And then, in the autumn of 1964, Cott's knife attacks suddenly stopped.
I think he just calmed down after he actually, for the first time, succeed to kill someone. He was just continue going to school, going to his shooting section, just normal everyday life.
Cott had got away with murder, but his deadly desires had not stopped. In fact, his murderous urges were growing.
He appeared to have stopped killing for a 2-year period, but during that period of time, he still would have been having violent thoughts and violent fantasies, and we can see that this is exactly the case with him.
He was still bent on killing, but this time he wanted to murder en masse. So at the end of 1964, Karol Kot changed his MO.
He turns his offending towards other outlets, setting fires, poisoning. So he's always creating harm. He's always externalizing his trauma to hurt other people.
He confessed that he had planned to kill a large number of people by changing his method to poisoning or arson.
He was putting poison, for example, into a bottle of beer and leaving that bottle of beer somewhere and hoping that someone will be tempted to drink it.
But thankfully, Kot's plan failed.
When you look at what he actually does, it really confirms how completely devoid of ordinary social understandings he has. He does things like go to drinking establishments, leave out drinks half drunk that have lethal doses of arson, and sits and waits for somebody to pick up the drink and drop dead. He doesn't have a grasp of social behavior, that people don't go around bars picking up half-drunk drinks and drinking them. That's just not what people do.
Kot then turned to arson.
He committed at least 4 arsons. We only know about them from his testimony. That's because these were failed arsons. For example, he poured gasoline on some rags in a room, and he hoped it would start a fire. It did not. He tried to set an attic on fire. He said there was smoke and fire, but no inferno.
Fortunately, no one was killed in any of the 4 fires that he set.
And again, he doesn't even know how to set a fire. He can't get a whole structure to burn down to save his life. He's just trying to find a way to get death to happen, doing as little as possible, and he can't seem to figure it out.
By February of 1966, 17 months after his first murder, Kot could no longer contain the urge to kill again.
I think he definitely would have been fantasizing during that period about those attacks he carried out before. So he carried out some very violent attacks that had a real impact on the local community. He created fear, and he was reveling in that. He was enjoying that. And when he came to kill again, it was going to be something horrendous.
But this time he changes direction. He doesn't target elderly women, he targets children. He goes to a local mound which attracts tobogganists, particularly children.
On Sunday, February the 13th, 1966, Karol Kot was looking for an easy target when he spotted 11-year-old Leszek.
He was just walking alone because he was a bit late to that competition. And Karol just was walking around looking for a victim.
For Leszek, the speed of the attack would likely have been stunning.
And this attack is really ferocious. So he turns the boy towards him. He stabs him 11 times. Now this is a real ramping up of his offending. So he's not just killing this individual, he's using much more violence than he needs to get that job done. So this is about more than that. This is about completely obliterating someone. This is about saying, well, I can do to you whatever I want to do to you. It's about status, it's about power, and it's about entitlement.
We must be grateful to some extent that stab wounds are not usually tremendously painful. They can often feel more like a punch, but it must have been utterly confusing and bewildering that somebody has suddenly started to assault you, and then very quickly, within probably seconds in this case, you will lose consciousness and die. You've gone from being a normal child, doing normal childhood things, to being a body.
The autopsy later revealed that Cott had punctured every major organ in the young boy's body.
The stabs were deep. The strikes damaged the aorta, the heart, the lungs and the liver. The boy had no chance of surviving the attack.
As Lasek lay bleeding to death, Cott walked away.
He just left him like this and walked away. What also surprised me was that he said that he went straight to the patisserie, bought some cakes and took them home.
The attack on the 11-year-old boy was a clear sign that Cott's ferocity had escalated.
This is Cott in his new form. This is the fully fledged butterfly. He's absolutely at one and determined to destroy his victim. It isn't very long before he chooses another.
Krakow, southern Poland. By the end of February 1966, Karol Cott, now aged 19, had viciously attacked 4 people with a knife, killing 2, 86-year-old Maria and an 11-year-old boy, Leszek. But Karol Cott's lust for blood was far from satiated. On April the 14th, 1966, 2 months after he last killed, Cott struck again.
His next attack is on a 7-year-old girl, so he's targeting vulnerable victims. He's targeting people who he feels he can control, who he feels he's got power over.
Cott hid in the stairwell of a city tenement building and waited for a suitable victim to attack.
His decision depended on who would appear. A 7-year-old girl came to the mailbox from the upstairs. He approached her, grabbed her with one hand, and stabbed her with the other. He stabbed her 8 times and left the girl wounded and bleeding.
Incredibly, 7-year-old Malgosia survived the brutal attack. However, the psychological scars would last a lifetime.
These children, because they are only just kind of forming their views of the world, their views of other people, and to be attacked randomly by someone who is also just a child is something that will stay with them forever and is going to shape their relationships with other people. Very often people who are attacked as children can move on from it. They can go on and have fulfilling lives and move on from their trauma, but it's something that really is going to set them off the track that they were on for quite some time.
After the vicious attack, Cott confessed to attacking the 7-year-old girl to the woman he was still obsessed with, Danusha.
He tells her what he's done, and I don't think this is any kind of remorse or any kind of catharsis. I think this is, look at me, look what I can achieve. You should be impressed by this.
For some reason, Cott decides to boast that he has attacked the child. She doesn't believe him. She thinks it's fantasy, another of Cott's constructions, until she reads about the story in a local newspaper about the stabbing.
The horrific truth then dawned on Danusha.
She realizes that the young man she's known, may be more dangerous than she thought he was. And she talks to a psychiatrist about the confession. He advises her to go immediately to the police.
Ultimately, the one person in the world who he could trust was the avenue to his being caught.
For the investigators, Danusha's information would prove crucial in identifying the schoolboy killer who had plagued Krakow for the last 2 years. Coupled with the description given by some of the surviving victims, Karol Kot was now the police's prime suspect. But they did not immediately arrest him.
In the months between April and July, they placed him under surveillance. And there was a good reason for that. They wanted to be absolutely sure that he was capable, that he was sane, and indeed they wanted him to sit his school examinations to prove it.
So the police waited until after he'd finished his exams before they arrested him. But this was a really high-risk strategy as well, because you're waiting to arrest somebody who has committed violent offence after violent offence, and I think this really did put the public at risk.
In the summer of 1966, a few months after his last attack, the Polish police finally apprehended Karol Kot.
And it's after his final exams in school, and I think that really does bring home how horrific this is, these horrendous crimes that have been committed by somebody who's so young, and when he's arrested in school.
The most striking moment of the case was when Karol Kot was arrested, and everybody realized that the beast, which was everybody afraid for such a long time, for 2 years, was just a young schoolboy.
Finally, the young man was under arrest.
You could say that Krakow breathed a sigh of relief. People stopped being afraid of a killer.
But Karol Kot was not ready to admit his guilt.
But when he was presented to the two elderly ladies that survived the first attacks, he was instantly identified by them. He even said to one of them, the one that shouted at him, "It's him," that if she wanted, he would finish killing her.
Karol Kot had no choice but to confess to his crimes.
Kot doesn't plead innocence. He glories in his guilt. That is exactly what he's always wanted. This is the tableau that he wanted to paint for himself. He tells them in elaborate detail about the way he killed.
He bragged about these crimes. He talked about these acts like it gave him pleasure.
And the press give him the nickname that he must have lusted after, the vampire of Krakow. I think he wanted to forever be remembered as one of the city's most dramatic residents. I wouldn't call him dramatic, I would call him depraved.
The term vampire was used, not only because he killed, but also because he drank the blood of his victims. He said openly that when he killed or maimed his victims, he took pleasure in licking the blood off the blade of the knife.
I think he really would have relished being called the vampire of Krakow. This is somebody who has got quite a narcissistic element to their personality. They want to be noticed. They think that they deserve to be noticed. They're entitled to be lauded by other people. And I think having that name, the vampire of Krakow, this brings with it some kind of status. And I think this is very important for him.
Soon after he was arrested in July of 1966, 19-year-old Karol Kot gleefully participated in the reconstructions of his crimes.
You know, police do reenactments as a common technique, and there are many reasons to do that. One of the most important reasons to do that is a reenactment is one of the ways that you determine whether or not a person claiming to be a killer is the real killer, or whether or not they're somebody who are just seeking the fame. The reenactment will show whether or not you did the crime in a way that is consistent with the physical evidence, and it allows you to be more sure.
A reconstruction can be a useful thing to do. It enables witnesses' memories to be jogged. It sometimes leads to new evidence. But in this case, I think he got more out of it than anybody else did.
He was actually a kind of directing all the show. And he was just saying to cameraman or where to put lights, I'm gonna stab from that direction, so that light shouldn't be here, you will not see anything, and stuff like that.
He was up on a pedestal. He was important for that moment. There was a crowd of policemen around him, a crowd of people, and finally, he could start showing off.
One of the policemen asked him, does it feel the same to do it all over again? He said that, well, almost, but I'm missing just one thing. And policeman asked, what is it? And he said, blood.
If there were any doubts among the police officers as to Cott's guilt, the young man's reaction during the reconstructions put them to rest.
It was obvious that he did it because they made the reconstruction of all 5 attacks, and he was showing every details what exactly he was doing.
He did not show any remorse. He was proud of what he did. He described the series of murders. He even showed how he licked the blood of the blade after he committed the homicide.
Karol Kott was put on trial in Krakow on the 3rd of May 1967.
Kott, killed as a schoolboy, stood trial for 2 counts of murder, 10 counts of attempted murder, 4 counts of arson, all before the age of 20.
In addition to his knife attacks on the 2 children and 3 elderly women, Kott was also prosecuted for the many other lives he was deemed to have put at risk in his poison and arson attacks.
Obviously, everybody was in shock. His whole family and friends were in shock that such an innocent-looking person from such a good family could do such terrible things.
In all, 64 witnesses testified at the trial. Many took to the stand to vouch for the young man's character.
Initially, everybody defended him, not only his family, but even his school teachers. There is a letter in the files written by his shooting section trainer that shows his support for Kott and his innocence.
But Kott's behavior in the courtroom shocked both friend and foe. The young man who'd killed 2 innocent people and had attempted to murder many more relished the limelight.
He was cheerful. He was laughing. While his friends were testifying, he was waving to them. You could see that on the films shot in the courtroom. He was proud then that he could perform almost like an actor, that he was the center of attention. He was even proud of what he did. It horrifies me.
During the trial, Kott displayed disdain for the pain and suffering he'd inflicted on the innocent.
At the trial, he just showed a complete disregard for his victims and their families. There was an absolute lack of remorse. And that doesn't surprise me whatsoever, because here we have somebody who only cares about themselves. If he felt sorry, he would only feel sorry for himself. He'd only be sorry that he got caught. And unfortunately, you're never going to get sympathy from somebody like this. They don't care about the mayhem that they create. They just care about what it's done for them.
He showed no remorse. There was no apologies to the victims. He simply went blank because he was fulfilling his own fantasy of himself. He was fulfilling the painting that he'd always wanted to paint of his life. This was Kott's creation, and the killings were that.
He didn't ever admit that he's feeling sorry. He was saying that to him it was moral, because what brings you pleasure, that is moral, and that it was his private thing that he was taking someone else's life, but he doesn't think that he is criminal.
Cott soon alienated his family and friends.
Had he not been caught, I think he would have just gone on to kill even more people in even more violent ways. This is somebody who enjoyed killing, who enjoyed feeling power over others.
When he started to say that it brought him pleasure and he would continue to kill, the voices of support fell away.
Cott confessed in detail to all of his crimes.
Usually the perpetrators of such killings defend themselves, try to come up with any line of defense. He did not do that.
After a series of appeals on March the 17th, 1968, Poland's Supreme Court convicted Karol Cott of 2 counts of murder, 10 counts of attempted murder, and 4 counts of arson.
When he was sentenced, the judge said of him that he was more dangerous than a savage beast because he was endowed with reason. Cott was certainly not insane. He never, for one moment, expressed an item of regret or remorse for any of his victims.
At the age of 21, Cott was sentenced to death.
On May the 16th, 1968, the 21-year-old Karol Cott was hanged by the neck and executed, thereby ending the story of a boy, and it's fair to call him a boy, who could truly be called one of the world's most evil killers.
Till the end, even after he was sentenced to death, he said in an interview that if he were to be released, he would kill again.
And Karol Cott was a psychopath. He knew what he was doing. He knew that it was wrong. This is somebody who chose to do evil. He knew the difference between right and wrong, and yet he chose to harm others anyway.
The senseless and sadistic murder of the most vulnerable of victims, an 11-year-old boy and an 86-year-old woman, as well as the attempted murder of children and the elderly while still at school, makes Karol Cott one of the world's most evil killers. In December 1998, a man slipped undetected into the home of 39-year-old Claudia Benton. By the time he fled the scene, the mother of 2 had been brutally beaten, sexually assaulted, and fatally stabbed.
He seemed to be almost ghost-like, the way he could get into houses without being heard, and, ghosts scare people.
The killer was a man named Angel Rosendez, who'd been illegally boarding trains across the US border from Mexico for over 20 years. He would go on to kill at least 9 people, but the authorities couldn't find him anywhere.
There's 140,000 miles of track in North America. So how do you get your head around that? How do you find someone that's riding the rail?
Capturing the Phantom Killer would prove to be one of the FBI's toughest cases to crack. No one was safe.
You never really knew who was going to be the next victim. It was whoever had something that he wanted, and that could be anybody.
Hidden away for so long, Angel Rosendez had emerged as one of the world's most evil killers. When Angel Rosendez handed himself into US authorities in July 1999, it signaled the end of his reign of terror. The 38-year-old Mexican walked across the border and was never free again. For over 20 years, Rosendez had been illegally crossing into the US, not by foot, but via the vast rail network. He'd murdered at least 9 people from Texas to Illinois. The media had dubbed him the Railroad Killer. Detective Ken Maher helped crack the case that finally brought the elusive killer to justice.
He turned out to be very mobile, extremely mobile. He was in one part of the country, and a few months later, he's in another part of the country.
Ken has his own theory behind Rosendez's spate of murders.
In Mexico, he had a wife and a kid, and he's stealing jewelry from these women and then taking it to Mexico to sell it. So it was a business, pure and simple. The killing and the raping of the women before and after death was just sidekick, just for fun.
This killer's story begins on the 1st of August, 1960. Angel Rosendez was born in the state of Puebla in the east of Mexico. Little is known about his childhood, but during his eventual trial, Rosendez spoke to forensic psychologist Ramon Laval about his early years south of the border.
Angel Rosendez grew up in a dysfunctional family. He didn't have a lot of connections with his family, siblings, or, for that matter, his parents. Little or no contact with his biological father. He told me that he had grown up with his mother and father. In fact, upon further questioning, I realized he was talking about his maternal uncle, his mother's brother.
He felt rejected by his mother. He felt rejected by his peers at school because he was quite awkward looking. He had protruding teeth. He wasn't one of the cool kids. And I think those feelings stayed with him, and they really did go on to shape who he became.
Now, I'm not saying that unsettled childhood equals inevitably some kind of person who's going to turn to murder and serial killing. But I am saying in this particular case, that childhood gave Angel this sense that there was no one to depend on. He was the only person he could depend on.
Violence was a fixture in the young boy's life.
His uncle, whom he considered his father, was reported to have been physically abusive with Angel, and around 12, he quit school and he actually left his uncle's home, started living on the streets, just defending for himself. He was sexually molested by a local pedophile.
Like many violent offenders, Rosendez was a victim before he was a criminal. And this is a line that we don't like to talk about very much. We like to compartmentalise victims and offenders very clearly, but often that line is a very blurred one.
Barely a teenager, Rosendez found himself with no family and no home. He had to learn how to survive.
It must have been a significant moment. It's on that cusp of adolescence and puberty. It's that moment when a young man, especially a young man from such a troubled background, struggles out of the cocoon and tries to find himself.
Rosendez took to illegally riding the far-reaching network of North American railroads. It was a transient lifestyle that would come to define him.
Rosendez managed to travel quite far and wide within the United States by jumping on trains, jumping on an empty freight train and holing up in one of the carriages. And that would take him to a range of cities all over the place.
Because you could leap on it. It's a stuff of movies, isn't it? Slow-moving railroad car, and the hobo is standing by the track, and he grabs it and lifts himself up into an empty car.
It is thought that he first entered the United States when he was maybe 13 years old. And that's what he told me, that he was back and forth between Mexico and the United States. But in fact, the first record, formal record, it's from when he was 16 years old, when he had entered and then deported.
After serving 5 years of a 20-year sentence in a U.S. prison for burglary, aggravated battery, and grand theft auto in 1980, Rosendez continued to ride the rails. In fact, by August 1996, the 36-year-old had been arrested 12 times and sent back to Mexico on no fewer than 7 occasions. But nothing deterred him, and his crimes would soon turn deadly.
One of the most complicated questions about Rosendez in the first instance is why he started killing. He was getting by. Things were not easy, and he was being deported back and forth across the Mexican-US border on a regular basis. But that was no real reason in itself to kill. And one of the most fascinating aspects of Rosendez's character is where that initial spark came from.
After illegally heading back north of the border on a train in the summer of 1997, Rosendez carried out his first known murder in Lexington, Kentucky.
In August 1997, there was an attack on Christopher Meyer and Holly Dunn, who were a young couple. So he'd spotted this couple after he'd jumped off one of the freight trains that he'd ridden on. And I think his intention from the outset was to get to Holly Dunn and to sexually assault her. And in order to do that, he needed to get Christopher out of the way. And he killed him relatively quickly with a 50-pound rock, which must have been the most horrendous thing for Holly to witness and for Christopher to experience.
With her boyfriend taken care of, Rosendez turned his attention to 20-year-old Holly Dunn.
She is terrified. Her hands are bound. She pleads with Rosendez for her life. He sits down beside her and shows her an ice pick and says, "Look how easily I could kill you." But in the end, he doesn't kill her with an ice pick. In the end, he rapes her. It's impossible to imagine the terror she must have felt, because now Rosendez goes away again and finds a wooden board and beats her mercilessly with it. Terrible injuries to her head, to her back, an attack so dramatic that he thought he'd killed her.
But miraculously, Holly Dunn had survived the brutal assault.
Holly Dunn, to her eternal credit, manages to struggle to her feet and literally walks away from the scene of the attack. She makes her way to some nearby houses where, thankfully, they call an ambulance and the police.
Rosendez had got away with it for now and remained unknown to the authorities. But it was a mistake that would later come back to haunt the killer. By December 1998, the 38-year-old was regularly crossing the border into the USA. Border Patrol authorities had apprehended Rosendez for illegal entry into the country 7 times in 1998 alone, unaware he'd killed 21-year-old Christopher Meyer the previous year. But now the killer was back on US soil in Houston, Texas, and had murder on his mind.
That day in particular was a Thursday, December 17th, and day like most any other day, the afternoon was uneventful. I left for work around 3:30 and picked my son up at the sitter. It was his 9th birthday, and I picked him up, and on the way home, I got a call from the dispatcher at West University Place saying, "We've got a body, a dead body." And I had chills and goosebumps thinking, it just can't be. It's got to be something else. It just got to be something else. But she assured me that, yes, there was indeed. Patrol officers had discovered a deceased female.
The murdered woman was 39-year-old research physician Dr. Claudia Benton. She'd been home alone. Ken walked into a horrific scene.
There was a bloody butcher knife on a pillow next to her head, blood all over the carpet, blood on the bed, blood in the hallway leading just out the threshold of the bedroom door. Overall, it appeared every room in the house had been rummaged, ransacked, drawers open. Everything appeared to be touched and looked through.
Dr. Benton had been stabbed to death with a knife from her own kitchen. There were 3 fatal wounds on her body.
In addition to that, she had 19 skull fractures from being beat upon the head. I can only surmise that some of them may have been from the bronze figurine. It was probably maybe about 1 foot in length that had been on the mantelpiece. Quite heavy. Part of it was broken off during the beating.
It was a savage and brutal murder of a wife and mother of twin girls.
I think there is an inherent misogyny to Rosendez. There is an inherent hatred of women, which I think goes back to his rather dysfunctional relationship with his mother. So he thinks that women are there to provide something for him, to give something to him. He feels entitled to take that.
Further investigation at the home suggested that Dr. Benton had been literally fighting for her life.
Dr. Benton had a complete fracture to her ulna and dislocated elbow as well. And so she put up a very, very fierce fight. From the blood in the hallway, it looks like she was very, very close to trying to escape from the bedroom and get away from him. But being hit so many times in the head already, he was just able to physically overpower her and subdue her.
After analyzing the bloody crime scene, Ken had to make one of the most difficult phone calls of his professional career to Dr. Benton's husband, George.
Very, very difficult talking to the man because here I am, I'm having to explain to him that there's a dead body in his house, and he's telling me the only person that should be in there was his wife. And I felt sick, felt really, really sick inside because I'm thinking to myself, I mean, what if that was me? So I tried to be as gentle as possible. I tried to give him every avenue out. Could it have been a nanny? Could it have been a maid? Anybody else? And he just kept telling me, no, it's just my wife's the only one that would be in there.
While Ken took Dr. Benton's devastated husband on a somber tour of the crime scene, he helped to point out anything that was out of the ordinary around the house.
It was actually George Benton that noticed the steering column housing in the garage. And he looked at it and said, that's got to be from the Jeep.
The killer had made his getaway in Dr. Benton's vehicle, but he'd failed to find the keys that were hanging up in a kitchen cupboard.
The next best thing he had to do was to try to hotwire the car. He knew he had to pop the steering column off, and so he did that. In doing so, he stuck his fingers in there to pry it out, and then he just set that into the garage. That was some of the best evidence that we had right there, were his 4 fingerprints on the underside of that piece of plastic.
This would become a crucial piece of evidence in the future trial of Angel Rosendez. Lynn McClellan was an assistant district attorney who would eventually help to bring charges against the killer.
The car's recovered in San Antonio. His fingerprints are found on the car. The car belongs to Claudia Benton. That kind of ties everything back. What's her car doing in San Antonio with Rosendez prints on it, and she's found dead back in Houston. So put 2 and 2 together, you say, he's probably the one who killed her.
A week after the murder of Claudia Benton, Ken had a major breakthrough. For the first time, Angel Rosendez would become known to the homicide detective, albeit under a different name.
It was the day after Christmas. I'd received a call from a sergeant with the Houston PD. He had received information from their fingerprint division. We had an identification of the perpetrator. Fingerprints came back to an individual named Carlos Cluthier Rodriguez, one of his numerous aliases that he was arrested under. So his prints were in the automated fingerprint identification system in Texas under that name.
Rosendez had used many different aliases, which made it difficult for the authorities to link him to his numerous misdemeanors through the years.
Every time he was arrested, it seemed to give a different name. I mean, Rosendez is what we finally kind of settled on in terms of a name, but he had used so many names in the past. So we knew he had fingerprint identification at that time. We knew who he was. We had pictures. And so we were slowly able to get these pictures out into the media and try to generate some tips and leads and so forth.
The hunt for Rosendez continued for over 3 months, but the killer remained elusive. By the spring of 1999, he was back in Texas, this time in the small city of Weimar. On the night of April the 30th, he entered the home of Norman and Karen Cernick.
The Cernicks were both asleep in their bed. From the evidence that was found, Mr. Cernick was laying on his left side, and the blow to the head with the sledgehammer woke up Mrs. Cernick. She sits up in bed, and Rosendez takes the sledgehammer left-handed like a baseball bat and strikes her square in the forehead, killing her instantly. He then goes back and hits Mr. Cernick one more time with the sledgehammer for good measure.
Rosendez had bludgeoned the church pastor and his wife to death. It was a vicious double murder by the seemingly opportunistic killer.
Rosendez was not an offender who would take weapons along with him to the crime scene. He would use whatever he could find that was there. He would decide to kill when he saw the opportunity to do so. There is an advantage to this as an offender, because if you're not carrying weapons around with you, then you're not carrying evidence around with you.
The escalation in Dr. Benton's case, he hit her with a smaller figurine and she fought back. This case with the Cernicks in Weimar, there was no fighting back. He made sure with that first blow, but he didn't want to fight. He had enough fighting the last time.
Evidence at the crime scene linked the Cernick murders to the killing of Dr. Claudia Benton.
They collected, of course, very good DNA evidence from the Weimar case. That was sent to Department of Public Safety laboratories, and DNA testing was done, and it was an exact match to our perpetrator in our case.
With at least 3 confirmed murders on his macabre resume, the FBI entered the search for the man who would later be given the moniker the Railroad Killer. Angel Rosendez, however, continued to use various aliases, so tracking him down wasn't going to be straightforward. Special Agent Bobby Knox-Eckerd was part of the team assigned to the case.
There's 140,000 miles of track in North America. So how do you get your head around that? How do you find someone that's riding the rail? So what you do is you go in, you meet with the 7 major railroad companies. They all have agents that work for them. They have railroad police. So they started pulling all of his records, and he had dozens of trespass records on the railroad.
The crimes that Rosendez committed had a significant impact, especially on those living by railway tracks, because there wasn't a specific victim type. You never really knew who was going to be the next victim. It was whoever had something that he wanted, and that could be anybody. So the level of fear, the level of anxiety that his crimes generated was horrendous.
Not long after the FBI's involvement in the case, they were able to link the unsolved murder of Christopher Meyer almost 2 years earlier to Rosendez.
We received a hit from 1997 where a couple was brutalized. The male was killed. The female was the only survivor of Rosendez, and that was in Kentucky near railroad tracks. Through DNA, through eyewitness testimony of the survivor, and through a sketch that she was able to give to the officers there, we were pretty sure it was the same person. Once the DNA came back, it was a positive hit. So now we had him responsible for at least 4 homicides.
At that point, we knew we had a serious killer on the loose.
But Angel Rosendez was only just getting started, and there would soon be even more victims. By late May 1999, authorities across the US were desperately searching for a man they now knew was a serial killer. The 38-year-old Mexican had been linked to at least 4 murders, 3 of them in Texas in the previous 5 months. The so-called Railroad Killer was headline news across the Lone Star State.
Rosendez is attracting growing notoriety in Texas. Inevitably, it feeds the vanity that has been growing inside him. He knows people are beginning to look for him, and yet he still feels he can get away with it. In fact, he was to kill again.
On June the 3rd, Rosendez was back in Houston and his bloodlust had become insatiable. Under the veil of night, he entered the home of 26-year-old Noemi Dominguez.
Noemi is an elementary school teacher. She is at home and he breaks in, picks up a pickaxe-like tool and attacks her. By now, Rosendez is quite clearly out of control. Any sense of order, of civilization, of propriety is gone. He is now literally like an animal lusting for blood, with blood dripping from him. Again, she's sexually assaulted, and again, he kills her.
She lived near railroad tracks. Her body was covered up. Almost looked very similar to the way Dr. Benton was covered up. The legs sticking out from underneath the covers. She was face down, and she had been beaten to death.
Rosendez decided to cover some of his victims with blankets because this essentially dehumanizes them, it depersonalizes them. But also, it's about looking, it's about seeing and being seen. So he's covering his victims because he doesn't want to look at them, but he also doesn't want them to look at him. So it's this constant theme of shame that comes up time and time again.
As the killer grew more experienced, he became more brazen in his actions. Rosendez had started leaving calling cards at the scene of his murders.
When he murdered the victims, he would find their ID, driver's license or some other type of ID, and would display them in such fashion that whoever entered the home later would find out who they were, how they looked like. In my mind, he wanted to see how they looked like before he bludgeoned them to death, before he raped them, and see what it would have been, almost as if had already developed a relationship with the victim.
After killing Noemi Dominguez, Rosendez wasn't finished. Just as he'd done after murdering Claudia Benton, he stole the schoolteacher's car and headed 100 miles west.
It was a white Honda, and it was taken and driven to Fayette County near Schulenburg, small community of Dubina, where he then murdered Josephine Konvichko. He toyed with law enforcement at that scene by displaying a toy train, displaying newspaper articles about the cases, the murders.
This is like reading an article that says, I am the railroad killer, and I'm leaving this here for you to know and make sure that you know it is me, nobody else. I am the railroad killer. He was proud of that.
It is yet further proof, if anyone needed, that he is now utterly out of control and glorying in every moment of his celebrity. It is one of the most troubling of moments when a killer starts to live up to his own hype, who becomes obsessed with his own fame.
Rosendez had killed 73-year-old Josephine Konvichko with the same pickaxe he'd used just hours before when murdering Noemi Dominguez.
When he left the premises, he'd actually left the pickaxe in Josephine's head and he tucked her up in bed, which was quite a bizarre kind of behaviour. But he'd left behind a really important piece of evidence because on that pickaxe was some of Noemi Dominguez's blood, so those two murders were connected.
Less than 2 weeks later, Rosendez had travelled far from Texas, over 800 miles north to Illinois. On June the 15th, 1999, he committed another double murder. The victims were 79-year-old George Morber and his 51-year-old daughter, Carolyn Frederick. George's home in the quiet village of Gorham was less than 100 yards from the railroad.
In Illinois, he found a shotgun. The elderly gentleman was in his easy chair reading his newspaper. Rosendez is able to gain entry into the house, ties him up with telephone cord, ties him to his easy chair, gets behind him with a 12-gauge shotgun and shoots him in the back of the head through the back seat of the recliner. A little while later, his daughter comes in, and she is immediately beat to death with the 12-gauge shotgun.
The slain father and daughter took the tally of known victims to 8. Authorities were becoming desperate to capture the elusive railroad killer.
He seemed to be almost ghost-like, the way he could get into houses without being heard, without disturbing the occupants. And that was one of the strangest things. I still don't know how he got into Dr. Benton's house and all the other houses. And that was a scary part. And ghosts scare people. It's just a natural reaction to something that can't be explained. And the way he was able to enter people's homes couldn't be explained.
The killings were becoming more frequent, and the hunting ground had become wider spread. The FBI immediately took action.
On June 21st of 1999, working with our FBI headquarters, we were able to add Rosendez to our top 10 most wanted fugitives. When anyone has made a top 10, both the media and the public are made aware of how important this case was. The media helped us immensely in this case. Everybody in the United States and in Mexico, to a certain extent, wanted this guy captured. He had turned from a serial killer, now he was a spree killer. And I think everybody in the world wanted him caught.
The addition of Rosendez to the most wanted list brought nationwide TV exposure.
So that's when the tips were coming in, and as the tips came in, anything that was really, really helpful, that sounded legitimate, was funneled to the task force. And it was just a huge coordinated effort in trying to find this guy.
I don't know if it was the media or the FBI, but he was given the name the Railroad Killer. And in every media blitz, you would see the railroad killer is on the run again. He's been here, he's been there, he's committed this crime.
The national exposure put pressure on the family and friends of Ángel Rosendez across the Mexican border.
This was the most complex case most of us had ever worked because the jurisdiction was huge. It was all the way in North America. You know, you just didn't know where he was going to be. Once we identified he had a wife or a common law wife in Mexico was the pivotal point for me.
Rosendez's wife was brought across the border to be questioned by the FBI. Bobby led the interview.
She was brought up here. She brought her daughter, who was approximately 3 or 4 months old, and we conducted the interview over a 2-day period. During that interview, I was able to provide her with enough information that she came to believe that he had committed the homicides. We showed her the DNA, we showed her fingerprints. We asked her if she had ever received anything from his trips into the U.S. After her visit here, the U.S. Marshals, the Texas Rangers, went back down into her village, and she provided everything that he had ever given her that she still had in her possessions, and they were, in fact, stolen at the crime scenes.
Rosendez remained in hiding, but the authorities were doing all they could to flush him out.
Once you take away all their comfort zones, they have nowhere to go, and they generally make mistakes, and you'll be able to apprehend them that way.
The tactics worked. With nowhere to run to, a sister of Ángel Rosendez convinced the killer to turn himself over to the U.S. investigators.
We had one sister who lived in New Mexico that would prove to be the person that negotiated surrender, that Texas Ranger developed trust with this individual. And through that development, she ended up contacting him and arranged a surrender.
And then it was his brother who accompanied him when he turned himself to the Texas Ranger in El Paso, the crossing between Mexico and the United States by the Rio Grande.
Now, this is something straight out of a movie. It really does have a lot of dramatic effect. And I think that is very revealing about Rosendez. He's the director in his own drama. He is calling the shots. He's in control.
After hunting the railroad killer for nearly 7 months, Detective Ken Maher was stunned when Rosendez gave up the ghost.
I'm amazed that he did it. All he had to do was just stay in Mexico and then come across on a train or come across the border whenever he wanted to and commit more murders and keep up his little side business of selling jewelry in Mexico and live happily ever with his wife and kid. I'm grateful that he turned himself in. To this day, I'll never know the real motive. I think he was maybe a bit concerned about his wife and daughter in Mexico being harmed, if there were some bounties on his head.
Soon after the capture of Rosendez, Ken found himself face to face with the serial murderer. After speaking to so many potential suspects over the previous few months, there was one thing in particular that Ken was looking for, to make sure they definitely got their man.
There were many times that my partner, Joey Sanders, and I would just get a frantic call at the police department, sometimes transferred from Houston PD, saying that the people swear they've seen Rosendez in some part of Houston. And one of the first things we do is grab his right hand, look at the ring finger, and if it didn't have a scar, even though it looked like him, we knew it wasn't him, because it showed up on every fingerprint card that he had. It was an extremely noticeable scar just straight through the pad of his ring finger. Sure enough, when we caught him, it's one of the first things I was able to do, I think, and sure enough, it was there. It was true to life.
Rosendez may have surrendered himself to the police, but there was no way this was going to be an open and shut case for prosecutors. With a trial looming, defense attorneys were going to tell the judge that the killer was insane. By now, investigators were aware that he'd killed 8 people and were still looking into whether there may be even more. The unsolved murder of an 87-year-old woman named Leafy Mason in Hugh Springs, Texas, was high on their list of potential victims.
At one of the task force meetings, we had a police officer from Hughes Springs, where Leafy Mason was murdered. They took out the complete window frame where the suspect in their case made entry, and they preserved it as evidence. And sure enough, they matched up his fingerprints. Rosendez, there he was. So we had a good match to that case as well.
Rosendez had bludgeoned the 87-year-old woman to death with a flat iron in October 1998, 2 months before the killing of Dr. Claudia Benton. Leafy Mason became the 9th known victim of Ángel Rosendez, but it's believed the total number of people who died at the hands of the railroad killer is even higher.
He confessed to 12 or 13 crimes, and they were able to confirm through DNA evidence that he had, in fact, committed those crimes.
The killer talked about his many possible victims with forensic psychologist Ramon Laval.
We didn't discuss the full chronology on what came first and second, third, fourth, but I have an idea that it started, as far as we know, in '86.
Ramon had been asked to evaluate the mental state of Ángel Rosendez after a judge informed the defense attorneys that the killer would be prevented from pleading not guilty by reason of insanity unless he was assessed by an independent psychologist.
He was not only willing to admit culpability, he talked about them. He said, yeah, he was the actor. He was the one who perpetrated them. And he would not be willing to give anybody else credit. He was very narcissistic, very self-absorbed. His manner of communication about the crimes was very calm, emotionally collected. He did not display any extreme emotional feelings about them, no sorrow, no regret.
Despite admitting to many murders, the prosecution only needed Rosendez to be found guilty of 1. So they had to find the most airtight case against him, the murder of Dr. Claudia Benton.
We had the strongest case by far. I think some of the other counties might have wanted to have had their own trial and convict him, but once he's convicted of capital murder in Texas, there's not much need to do it again.
Assistant District Attorney Lynn McClellan was part of the prosecution team.
In every criminal case, you have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's really just proving the elements of that crime. The evidence of who did it came from his fingerprints. In Claudia Benton's case, and fingerprints in the apartment, fingerprints on the car that was recovered in San Antonio afterwards. So that's really not a real difficult case to prove because all the evidence is there. Fingerprints and DNA are much better than eyewitness because eyewitnesses can make mistakes and fingerprints and DNA are not.
The trial began on May the 8th, 2000 in Houston, Texas. Ken Maha was in the courtroom.
One thing that stuck out immensely was the amount of weight that Rosendez gained. He looked like a completely different person. He must have put on 40 to 50 pounds, maybe even more. He was quiet, didn't say a word. I don't believe he said one single word throughout the trial, unless he was conversing with his attorneys.
As expected, the defense attorneys claimed that 39-year-old Rosendez was not guilty by reason of insanity.
They say he's schizophrenic. They say he's any kind of a mental disease. Did that cause him to do it? Did he know right from wrong? Obviously he knew right from wrong because he was trying to get away, and he got away. I mean, there are lots of people that have mental diseases. They don't all go around killing people.
Before the trial, Rosendez had been quoted in the media calling himself an angel of God, but Ramon Laval didn't agree with the killer's theory.
My main concern was if he was insane at the time of the offense, and if he was doing the will of God, where did the rape come from? He could not quite explain that. It was like, I wonder why you're asking me that question. You know, I hadn't quite thought about that.
So basically, it's almost a confession that I did this. But when I did this, I didn't know right from wrong. I didn't know what I was doing, and thus I can't be held legally responsible. I get a get-out-of-jail-free card because I didn't know right from wrong.
Ramon's testimony put the idea that Rosendez was insane firmly to bed.
My conclusions at the end were, despite his expression of delusions, statements that had a very delusional flavor, I came to believe that he was not insane and that he was just smart and manipulative and knew how to use information.
As a final nail in the coffin, prosecutors called Holly Dunn to the stand. The testimony of the girl who cheated death at the hands of Rosendez in Kentucky 3 years previously left the jury in no doubt. On May the 18th, 2000, Angel Rosendez was found guilty of the murder of Dr. Claudia Benton. 4 days later, he was sentenced to death.
I knew that the verdict was going to be guilty. There was really no defense put up. When he was sentenced to death, I was happy. To me, it was the appropriate punishment. Not to get into any of the debates about death penalty, right or wrong. In Texas, that was a punishment, and that's what he got.
Rosendez was on death row for 6 years before his stay of execution came to an end. On June the 27th, 2006, FBI Special Agent Bobby Knox Eckerd went to Huntsville, Texas, to witness the death of the railroad killer firsthand.
He's brought in, he jumped up on the table, they prepare him, and they allow him to make a statement. In this case, he apologized to the victims, but he then kind of claimed that the devil made him do it. He said it was my fault because I let the devil into my life, but the devil was responsible. And the drugs were administered at that point, and the very last thing he was asking in Spanish for forgiveness from God. And then he died very peacefully. I felt no joy in the fact that he had been executed. I felt nothing towards him other than anger for what he had done to the victims and what he left the victims' families to deal with for the rest of their lives. He was gone, but they still are here having to deal with his crimes.
What Claudia Benton's husband said probably sums it up. He was evil, contained in human form. A creature without a soul. No conscience, no sense of remorse, no regard for the sanctity of life. Because with Rosendez, it's all about him. He's the one in charge. He's the one he's trying to satisfy. He went through his whole life, thinking he had the right to do all these things, and whatever he wanted to do, he did it because he was the one in charge.
After taking the lives of so many others, 45-year-old Angel Rosendez had himself been put to death. He is no longer a danger to innocent people.
He was probably the most evil person that I ever was involved in the investigation, and I've investigated lots of murders, child molesters, kidnappers, but I think this guy was inherently evil.
He's just a savage animal, an absolute savage animal. The way he dealt with his victims was just completely savage.
Angel Rosendez spent his entire life in the shadows of society. Holed up in freight train carriages across America, he was able to carry out his crimes completely undetected. Why he started raping and killing the victims of his burglaries, we shall never know. But the amount of people he slayed suggests that he enjoyed the act of murder, and proves that Angel Rosendez is one of the world's most evil killers. Over the August bank holiday weekend in 1988, the mining village of Wath-upon-Dearne in South Yorkshire, England, was rocked to its core. The body of 25-year-old Marcus Law was discovered in his home. He'd been tortured and mutilated.
There were blood all over the place, and then he got cigarettes stuck in every orifice in his face. He got them in his nostrils, even in his eyes, his ears, mouth, and it just looked like a birthday cake with candles in.
In a final act of callousness, the killer had inserted one of Marcus's own crutches into his abdomen.
The sheer enormity of the violence used in this case is extreme. It is, to use that word, truly evil.
The killer was 21-year-old Anthony Arkwright. Over the coming days, more bodies would be discovered in similarly horrific circumstances.
He didn't just kill his victims, he completely obliterated them, humiliated them, and he didn't feel bad about doing it. If anything, he quite enjoyed it.
Even the police were wary of what they might discover next.
I was frightened, no two words about it. And I said to my colleague, "You know what we're going to find?" And he said, "Yes, Sarge." And I said, "You have to brace yourself for this."
In less than a week, 4 victims were discovered. Anthony Arkwright had been revealed as one of the world's most evil killers. August 1988, Wath-upon-Dearne, South Yorkshire, England. Late in the afternoon, on the same day as disabled resident Marcus Law's badly mutilated body was discovered, a neighbour, Anthony Arkwright, was arrested for his killing. Just 2 days later, 45-year-old retired teacher Raymond Ford was found brutally murdered. He'd been stabbed 250 times before his organs and intestines were removed and trailed around his flat.
Marcus is bad enough, with cigarettes poking out of his gouged out eyes and a crutch stuck into his stomach, but this is worse, if it's possible. There's virtually no organ left inside his body. Raymond's entrails are all around him. They're in the bathroom, they're in the bedroom, and they're in the hallway.
As Arkwright's lawyer proclaimed his client's innocence to the press, news of a second neighbour found slaughtered after his arrest began to spread. A wave of fear descended on the community. Retired Detective Constable David Winter discovered the second victim.
It did spread a lot of unrest because of the fact that the second body were found while he was in custody. That gave credence to, we've got a madman running loose at Wath. So everybody's thinking, yeah, it's not him then. You know, it's got to be somebody else.
There was more to come. Within days, 2 further victims were discovered, including Arkwright's own grandfather, Stanislava Podorkas. Former Detective Sergeant Richard Venables grew up in the village and remembers how inconceivable it was that these horrific crimes had happened there.
Wath-on-Dern, a little sleepy mining village, which it would be. We were on the verge of pit closures at that time. It's the last place on earth you would have thought that this thing could happen. And I even think about it now and say that Wath-on-Dern had a serial killer. As long a shot as a lottery win, really.
The impact of crimes like this on any local community are going to be devastating, because here's somebody who has been in this area for a while. People know who he is. He's a familiar face. This isn't some monster that's coming from the outside. It's the evil within.
This killer's story begins on the 24th of March 1967. Anthony Richard Arkwright was born in a row house in Wath-upon-Dern in South Yorkshire. The son of a milkman, he was the middle child of 5 siblings, and his family life was dysfunctional from a very early age.
Arkwright spent a lot of his early years in and out of children's homes, and this for me means that he has a very insecure attachment with his caregivers. So this is a child who doesn't feel security, doesn't feel warmth, and what that can sometimes translate into is this kind of defensiveness, this sense in which I can't depend on other people. It's just me and I've got to look after myself.
Arkwright struggled at school and was teased by his peers as people began to speculate about the true nature of relationships within his family.
Arkwright was bullied at school because there were rumours that were completely untrue that he was the result of an incestuous relationship between his mother and his grandfather.
The reality is not what counts, it's what he thought and what he experienced that was out there, and the kids thought it was true. And so he was teased a great deal. And when an individual is teased repetitively in childhood, it affects them emotionally in very, very significant ways.
Off the back of the bullying, Arkwright kind of retreats into himself. He spends a lot of time on his own. He's a loner. And when people don't have those social connections with others, they ruminate. They spend a lot of time thinking about things, especially ways in which they've been wronged by other people. So you've got this kind of undercurrent of rage, I think, that's developing in him.
The resentment that young Anthony Arkwright harboured for his family smouldered inside him, and he became a troubled teenager. He often found himself on the wrong side of the law, and he was a well-known face in the local police stations. David Winter remembers him as one of their regulars.
I've known Arkwright since he was about 14-year-old. He was a petty thief and we were forever locking him up when he was a juvenile.
Over the coming years, he became obsessed with weapons and had a reputation for being a habitual troublemaker.
He got quite a few convictions for petty crime, you would call it. Not petty to the victims, but burglaries, damage, small assaults and things like that. He was forever getting into trouble, and he'd been sent to youth custody and various other penalties that had been imposed on him over the years. But he was a troublesome lad altogether.
And while he was in prison, perhaps he saw a way of making himself glamorous. He took a great interest in Jack the Ripper and the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, reading books about them. Perhaps for the first time in his life, a subject engaged him. He developed this fascination with mass murder, and I think perhaps he saw it as a way of making his mark in the world.
By the summer of 1988, the 21-year-old was working at a scrap metal merchant's in Mexborough and living in nearby Wath-upon-Dern in public housing on the Denman Road estate. Neil Hurst was one of his neighbours.
Anthony Arkwright seemed very weird to me. He looked like a a young Clint Eastwood, and he was very, very frightening, kept himself to himself. He used to wear long coats and cowboy hats, and he used to have roll-up coming out at the side of his mouth.
He was one of the people that he wanted to draw attention to himself. He really loved himself. Tall, a lot taller than me. But he'd spiked his hair and he'd bleached the points of it and things like that to get a distinctive look.
Another of Arkwright's neighbours was 45-year-old Raymond Ford.
He was a gentleman who lived opposite Arkwright in a block of flats. He was a retired school teacher, suffering from ill health, and kept himself very much to himself.
Raymond and Arkwright had history. Arkwright liked to bully him. At one point, he shoved excrement through his letterbox.
In August 1988, Raymond was burglarised. Several items had been stolen, including a microwave oven and a mantel clock. He reported it to the local police.
One of the second-hand dealers came up to the police station and mentioned that he'd bought a microwave oven from Tony Arkwright, given his name, and he paid £20. So then it was decided that Arkwright was going to be arrested.
On the 26th of August, the Friday before the bank holiday weekend, Arkwright was fired from his job at the scrapyard for poor attendance. He was extremely aggrieved. To add insult to injury, early the next morning, the police were knocking on his door and he was arrested for the burglary of Raymond's flat. The officers were surprised to find a whole arsenal of knives in his home, but there was something else that sparked their interest.
They found in his flat a pocket watch, and it was the pocket watch that was unique, that they'd not seen before, and decided that it wasn't right that he would have such a pocket watch. It was an old person's pocket watch. And so they decided to bail Arkwright on the Saturday evening in order that they could make further inquiries.
Having just started his evening shift, Detective Constable David Winter was tasked with getting a statement from Raymond Ford about the burglary. He offered Arkwright a lift.
I took him back home, and as he's going into his flat, which is on the right-hand side, I went to the left-hand side to Raymond Ford's, knocking on the door, and he hadn't gone in at that time. And he just says, oh, he'll be out now, he'll be going around pubs, he's a drunk. So, I said, well, I'll come back. And I left it at that.
At the time, it seemed like an innocent remark, but Arkwright would do everything he could to stop the police from getting a statement from Raymond. In less than 24 hours, Arkwright had lost his job and been arrested. He needed an outlet for the pent-up energy simmering inside him.
I was coming down steps, and Tony approached me, and he said, "Are you going out tonight?" And I just said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you mind if I come with you?" Well, I thought, he's never done no wrong to me. You know what I mean? It might be a chance to get to know him a bit better.
Later that evening, Arkwright met up with Neil and his cousin. As the three men got into the car, a neighbour, 25-year-old Marcus Law, blocked their way.
I started engine, and then Marcus came in front of me in his wheelchair, shouting, "Where you going?" And I says, "Get out of the road, Marcus, we're going out." And then all I heard next from back at car was Tony Arkwright say, "I'm going to kill that bastard." And then that's when I thought, wow, I said, "No, he's only having a laugh." He says, "I'm going to kill that bastard." And I looked at his face, and I could see from his eyes that he meant what he said. Yeah, and I believed it.
Once at the nightclub, Arkwright's behaviour didn't improve. He was so aggressive that they were eventually thrown out by bouncers. Arkwright's whole demeanour that night made Neil incredibly nervous.
To be honest, I didn't feel safe myself at that time. And I'm just lucky that we managed to get home and he got out of my car. Then what happened next were unbelievable. In them days, he used to have a bin, like a metal bin, and I saw him. He just picked it up and threw it straight through Raymond's flat window. I'm thinking, what's he going to do? Is this ticking bomb now going off? What's he done that for? All I needed to know was I didn't need to be there. And I said to my cousin, "Let's go."
Whilst Neil and his cousin called it a night and made a hasty retreat, Anthony Arkwright was only just getting started. He had a score to settle with his neighbour. The bin was merely the beginning of what he had in store for Raymond Ford.
Raymond, according to Arkwright, had told the police about the burglary, had suggested Arkwright was responsible, and in doing so, he'd taken the power away from Arkwright, and Arkwright wanted that power back.
In the early hours of Sunday the 28th of August, Arkwright entered Raymond's flat using a key that he'd stolen during the burglary. Bizarrely, he was dressed in just a pair of underpants and a devil's mask.
But he didn't want to leave any forensic traces on clothing. That was why he was wearing the devil mask and also a pair of underpants.
Not only did Arkwright kill Raymond Ford, he stabbed him 250 times. That's 250 decisions to cause harm to this individual. And then he draped his entrails around the home.
The force that Arkwright used to stab Raymond was so great that several of the knives actually broke in two.
He must have been stabbing and stabbing for a very long time. There are broken knives. He would have had to go and get another knife. You would suspect he'd probably have to have a rest during that, because simply the repetitive action 250 times would be incredibly physically difficult.
Worse still, he takes out just about every single entrail from Raymond's body and drapes them not only in the bedroom, but all round the flat. Imagine the scene.
Arkwright is somebody who has always felt a sense of humiliation, a sense of shame, and now he's projecting that onto his victim. He's saying, I'm the powerful one now, I can do what I want to you.
Shortly afterwards, Neil Hurst was woken by loud banging. Arkwright, having washed off Raymond's blood, was pounding on his door.
I had some banging at the door, and when I looked through people, it was Tony. I just answered the door, and I went into me cousin's bedroom, opened the door, because he went, who's fucking banging? I just said, it's Tony from downstairs. Just leave it. You can't get in. That was last we heard.
Later that day, David Winter was back on shift. He was conscious that he needed to get a statement from Raymond about the burglary.
Went straight to Raymond Ford's, thinking, catch him before the pub's open. And still no reply. And still Arkwright comes out and he says, well, he'll be out of it now. They've been drinking all day and he'll be out of it. You'll not get him. And I'll keep coming back. I did that all evening. Knowing that the file's got to be in on the Monday morning, I was desperate to try to get this statement. And each time I knocked on Ford's door, Arkwright came out. And it was strange, you know, it was like he was waiting for me.
Arkwright spent much of that Sunday afternoon with Marcus Law, the same neighbour that he'd recently threatened to kill. 25-year-old Marcus had been injured in a motorbike accident as a teenager and lived in a bungalow on the Denman Road estate.
Arkwright had shared his cigarettes with Marcus Law, and he didn't have any money with which to buy any more cigarettes. And so he was quite sure that Marcus Law would have cigarettes in his bungalow, but he'd not shown him where the cigarettes were. And so that was what caused the argument later on in the night.
On the Sunday evening, Arkwright paid Marcus another visit to try to persuade him to give up some cigarettes. Still, Marcus insisted he had none, and so Arkwright proceeded to search the bungalow.
And then Arkwright discovers that there are some cigarettes in a drawer, and he feels, you know, that I've been lied to. So it's this sense of real disproportionate reaction to a kind of everyday situation.
We're now dealing with someone who's disintegrating into a desperate, horrific, sadistic fantasy. All we know is that in what can only be described as an utterly depraved manner, Arkwright attacks Marcus relentlessly.
Marcus is not just killed, he's brutalised. Arkwright stabs him over 70 times, and when he's there with his body in the flat afterwards, he takes cigarettes and puts them into his ears, his nose, his eyes.
You look at that and say, well, how could he possibly be so angry at this neighbor? What did the neighbor do to deserve that? And the answer is nothing. But it was a displacement from all of the anger that Arkwright felt over the years onto other people, the neighbor being one.
The following day was the bank holiday Monday. Marcus's mother was moving away for a new job, and at 11:30 in the morning, she called round to say goodbye to her son.
And was unable to get in originally, which was unusual. And she managed to slip the chain on the front door and get access to the place, and she found that he'd been very brutally murdered.
Marcus's distraught mother ran to the police station. David Winter was one of the first officers on the scene.
He was laid out on the floor, and all his chest cavity were open. There was a crutch through his body, it was actually sticking up. There was blood all over the place, and then he got cigarettes stuck in every orifice in his face. He got them in his nostrils, even in his eyes, his ears, mouth, and it just looked like a birthday cake with candles in.
The quiet mining village of Wath-upon-Dearne now had a major murder investigation on its hands. Detective Superintendent Michael Burdis was called in.
It was Bank Holiday Monday, and I was at home gardening and got a call to attend at the scene of a murder at Wath.
As Michael made his way to Wath Police Station, an officer leaving Marcus's bungalow saw Arkwright in the street.
And expected Arkwright to speak to him because they were on good terms and they spoke to each other whenever they met. Arkwright crossed the road away from him, and Humphreys was very suspicious of that because it was very unusual, and so called him across and decided that he would invite him back to the police station so they could have a chat.
When Michael arrived, Arkwright was already in the interview room.
So far as we knew, Arkwright was a friend of Marcus Law's, and we were following that line of inquiry. What did he know about the movements of this friend? So we'd no reason to really suspect Arkwright of any particular crime, except that he'd ignored this particular detective, which was unusual.
Investigations into Marcus's killing continued, with officers making door-to-door inquiries in the hope of finding witnesses who may have seen his killer. On the Monday evening, they spoke with a lady who recounted how Arkwright had visited her that morning and he'd broken the news that Marcus was dead.
He said to her words to the effect, "It's a pity about Marcus," and had explained that Marcus had died, and she thought that Marcus Law had probably committed suicide. But that was an hour before Marcus Law's mother had found the body, and so it was quite clear that Arkwright must be a prime suspect for that crime.
Clearly, Arkwright had inside information, and he was arrested on suspicion of Marcus's murder.
Arkwright wasn't admitting that offence. Arkwright was merely rambling on all sorts of subjects and talking anything but the actual response to the questions about the crime itself. At the same time, we had a major investigation to undertake with house-to-house inquiries, with searches of the scene, searches of the area, the post-mortem and the rest of the material that goes on with a major crime investigation.
On Wednesday the 31st of August, as officers continued to speak to residents, David Winter's thoughts returned to Raymond Ford. He'd been so involved with the murder investigation that he still hadn't managed to get a statement from Raymond about the burglary. Coincidentally, he was the only resident that the house-to-house team hadn't managed to get in contact with.
So I went down with a uniform lad, and at that time, his front window was smashed. So looking in, we could see this sea of bottles that went from the window right to the back of the room, like a slope. And his chair was in front of the TV. Big piles of newspapers all over the place. He wasn't sat in his chair, but the television were on. So they said, well, you better go in and have a look.
David made his way in through the broken window. It was immediately obvious that something was amiss.
I could just see blood all over the wall and all over the floor, big piles of it. So I'm stepping over it. Detective Inspector came down, he's in the door, says, I can't let you in, there's no keys. But I'm talking to him. He said, but what's it look like? I said, well, It's carnage in here. There's blood everywhere. It's dried on floor. So is he in there? I'll have another look. So then I looked through into a bedroom, and behind the door was his body, but it were all covered up with cloths and that. But I could see a hand. So I said immediately, yeah, he's here.
You couldn't call it anything other than a tip, but it was literally 3 feet deep in clothing, and underneath that was the body of Raymond Ford, having suffered grotesque injuries.
Whilst the police were making their grisly discovery, Arkwright was appearing at Rotherham Magistrates' Court, charged with the murder of Marcus Law and the burglary at Raymond Ford's flat. Detective Superintendent Michael Burdis now had a second horrific crime to investigate, but he already had a good idea who was going to be their prime suspect: Anthony Arkwright.
2 of the detectives who had been talking to him were sitting in a canteen area and waiting for his solicitor to attend. So they were merely sitting waiting, and during that time on the table was a pack of cards, and Arkwright was flicking through these cards, and eventually he said to the detectives, I can read the cards, and he turned over the 4 of hearts, and he said, 1 you've got, 2, 3, 4 to come. That prompted alarm in those officers, because they, as far as they knew, there was just the one body. And so they rang that information through to me at the incident room. But of course, by that time, we'd found Raymond Ford's body, which meant then that there were 2 more.
He didn't want to act like the ordinary criminal, the ordinary murderer who goes there and confesses, or start crying, you got me, oh my God. He didn't want to do that at all. He wanted to do the opposite of that. He wanted to be newsworthy, to be notorious, to be infamous in some way.
The case had just been blown wide open. The police now believed there were more victims, but they had no leads as to who these unfortunate souls may be. Both known victims had been from the Denman Road estate, and all available police resources were sent to the area to knock on doors and make sure that every resident was safe and well.
And we used the local authority, who provided us with a joiner to help us to break into properties if we couldn't get in the fear that there might be a body there. But at the same time, we had another team of officers trying to trace his family background and his family relations and other people that he may well have been in contact.
Detective Sergeant Richard Venables was part of the team investigating Arkwright's background.
So I was actually tasked, with my local knowledge in mind, to look at Arkwright's family to try and build up a picture of the guy in custody who had allegedly committed these horrific murders.
Through his inquiries, Richard learned that Arkwright's grandfather, a 68-year-old Lithuanian gentleman named Stanislava Padorkas, lived with his partner Elsa Konradaite in nearby Mexborough.
We made several visits to that house from about Tuesday the 30th of August. Went once, twice a day. We didn't get any joy.
By Friday, September the 2nd, the police still hadn't managed to speak to the couple. But neighbours had noticed normal activity at the house. The bottles of milk left on the doorstep had been taken in each day.
They assumed that either the grandfather or Elsa were collecting it and taking it into the house. But actually, the milkman was going by later on in the day, noticing that it hadn't been taken in, and he was taking it away.
So that meant that we knew that there'd been no activity at that house, and so we feared for the safety of his grandfather.
On the Friday afternoon, Richard paid a final visit to the house in Mexborough. When yet again there was no response, he had no option but to break in.
I noticed that the upstairs window of the front bedroom was open. I needed to source something to get up there, so the next door neighbour, he loaned me his ladder. When I looked through the window and I saw the untidy ransacking of the bedroom, I knew there was a problem.
The scene was reminiscent of many burglaries they'd seen before, and so Richard and his colleague made their way through the window into the bedroom.
And when I got into that room, I smelt death before, many times, and I knew the house had got the smell of death. What I was going to be confronted by, I didn't know. And that's when the heart started to quicken.
After a search of the upstairs room revealed nothing but ransacked belongings, Richard prepared himself to go down the stairs.
If I just ask you to transport yourself into this position, you're an investigator, you've been briefed as to what this guy's allegedly done. He's disemboweled a guy, he stabbed him 250 times, he stabbed another disabled guy 70 times, he sliced his body open, he rammed a crutch up the body, and then all of a sudden, you know you're going to discover this guy's work. I was frightened, no two words about it. And I said to my colleague, you know what we're going to find? And he said, yes, Sarge. He said, I know. And I said, remember the pictures. You have to brace yourself for this. We walked down the stairs together, and as we got to the spot where the landing and the banister opened up sufficiently, I leaned forward and I looked back towards the kitchen. The old lady who was laid in the kitchen door, and I saw the axe protruding from her head. Clearly she was dead.
The body was that of 72-year-old Elsa Conradite, Arkwright's step-grandmother. She'd been ironing on the kitchen table when she was attacked.
She's struck in the head with an axe, but there's none of the excess that's shown with the other victims. It's not the sort of clear message that he's trying to send with the others. It's simply getting rid of a problem.
My next consideration was, where is Grandad? And Grandad wasn't there. But I had an idea where he was, because as part of our investigation that week, I'd been told by locals that Grandad had an allotment.
The allotment was locked. The allotment shed was locked. It was quite a substantial home build. His grandfather had been a miner, and it was a really well-made piece of equipment, and we had to open that first.
Once they'd broken through the door, Michael and his team made yet another gruesome discovery.
Inside the shed itself was a workshop, really, and Arkwright's grandfather was jammed against the legs of this workbench, and again he'd been very savagely attacked.
Arkwright stabbed him. First of all, he stabbed him with such force he severed the spinal cord. That in itself is an incredible level of violence. That wasn't enough for him. He then strikes him with an axe, almost certainly when he's paralysed and unable to respond, and with a large, heavy hammer. So this is not just killing, this is sheer, needless brutality.
Later, Arkwright would tell investigators that he'd killed his grandfather partly because of the rumours that he may actually be his father. Rumours that had tainted his whole life, and it perhaps gives a clue as to why he would exercise such extreme brutality on the old man.
This was much more violence than was needed to end his grandfather's life. So these feelings of shame, of humiliation, of rage really coming to the surface. And I think it's a way of kind of retaliating. It's a way of taking back power.
Although Arkwright was obviously the prime suspect, you take all the right steps to make sure that you gather all the scientific material that you can gather.
As crime scene investigators meticulously gathered evidence, 21-year-old Anthony Arkwright remained in police custody at Rawmarsh Police Station, charged with murdering 4 people, including his own grandparents. Although he was confident they had identified the serial killer, Detective Superintendent Michael Burdis knew that proving the case might not be that simple.
One of the problems that we had was that Arkwright had a right to be in some of the premises, the grandfather's house, the grandfather's allotment shed, so any traces of fingerprints or DNA could have been legitimately there, and so didn't really provide us with tangible evidence. So it was a matter of proving that Arkwright had actually committed the murder rather than merely being present at the scene. What did give us evidence was the fact that there were items that were stolen from those premises.
In particular, one item seized when Arkwright was first arrested for the burglary at Raymond Ford's flat now became very significant.
The pocket watch that was found in his flat, that we believed originally had come from Raymond Ford, was actually his grandfather's.
With difficulties gathering evidence conclusively linking Arkwright to some of the murders, Michael knew that what they really needed was a confession. However, despite already having spent several days in the interview room being questioned about Marcus and Raymond, Arkwright had refused to give up any information.
He refused to answer questions. He did talk, but he wasn't answering questions that were rational and wasn't giving responsible answers to anything that we were asking him.
When he learned that the bodies of his grandparents, Stanislava and Elsa, had been found, and another 2 murder charges were to be brought against him, Arkwright made an unusual request.
He asked if he could be interviewed on tape. Now, we weren't using tape-recorded interviews in those days, but we were about to start the process, so we decided to go ahead in the hope that Arkwright would then find the facility useful for him and would be able to talk to us. It didn't work quite like that, because he merely enjoyed the experience and rambling on tape about horror films that he'd watched and experiences that he'd tried to relive himself. But none of it was a response to the questions about the murders. And so I put a stop to that.
Michael Burdis was getting tired of Arkwright stringing his officers along. Later that evening, Arkwright was fetched from the cells and the detective superintendent himself started the tape in the interview room.
I asked him questions. He didn't respond at all. I continually asked him if he would identify his name for the purposes of the tape, and he didn't respond to that. I asked him questions about his family. He didn't respond. He never spoke at all. So that I switched the tape off, and I came out of the interview room quite frustrated. And about 5 minutes later, his solicitor came down the corridor and said, "He wants to speak to you." So I refused to go through the scenario again. But the solicitor really was very persuasive and said, "I think he does want to talk to you." So I went back into the interview room. As I was setting the machine up again, he sang a little song, something like da-di-da-di-da. And I said, "Strangers in the Night." And he said, "You've named that tune in one. I'll speak to you."
And then, of course, the reality begins to pour out of Arkwright. Because in a period of just 56 hours, he's brutally killed, and you cannot say more strongly, brutally, savagely dispatched 4 people.
And he then went on to make a full confession of the murder of Raymond Ford and Marcus Law, and then started to speak about his grandfather, and the tape ran out.
He'd had to endure more of Arkwright's games, but Michael had managed to get confessions for 2 of the murders. The following morning, the interview resumed, and Michael hoped Arkwright would also confess to killing his grandfather and Elsa.
He didn't have a problem reacting to the grandfather's murder. They'd argued over the fact that they'd not rebuilt this motorcycle they were supposed to be working on. And he felt justified in committing that particular crime.
He also began to speak about something that had haunted him since he was a child, the local folklore that his grandfather was in fact his father.
Whether Arkwright ever believed that to be the case, it wasn't true. It certainly wasn't the father of Arkwright. But Arkwright did give that information and imply that was maybe why he'd murdered his grandfather.
When it came to talking about Elsa's murder, however, Arkwright's whole demeanour changed.
His voice went particularly quiet. He was talking about darkness and light, black and white. He was black and Elsa was white. And the fact that Elsa was Lithuanian, like his grandfather, and didn't speak any English, he was concerned that she didn't understand the language, and he felt that he was doing the right thing by taking her life.
Her killing, it wasn't as violent as the other murders in this killing spree, which suggests to me that she wasn't part of this kind of project of vengeance. She hadn't done anything to, in his mind, justify or deserve the kind of violence that he enacted on other people. So she was literally a barrier that had to be removed.
Arkwright revealed that his killing spree had started on Friday the 26th of August, the day he was fired from his job at the scrapyard.
And in the wake of that firing, he set off on a 56-hour killing spree, which would leave 4 people dead.
The victims were found in the opposite order to that in which they'd been killed. His grandfather might have been the last to be discovered, but he was Arkwright's first murder. For his neighbour Neil Hurst, this was a shocking revelation. It meant that Arkwright had already killed at least 2 people by the time he was trying to get into Neil's flat in the early hours of Sunday the 28th of August. It put a different perspective on Arkwright's motive for the visit.
I reckon if I'd answered that door, I would have been killed that night myself. Definitely, if I'd answered the door to him. I think he would have to do what he could do and try being a bigger hero in one night. So yeah, I think he'd have took my life if I'd answered that door.
In July 1989, Anthony Arkwright appeared at Sheffield Crown Court. He was charged with 4 counts of murder.
At the trial, Arkwright really is the director and star of his own movie.
He was most flamboyant. He appeared wearing a jacket and a bow tie in court, and he waved at the journalists and waved at people.
If you look at pictures of him at the time, you see the face of a man who's almost sneering at the camera, as if, look what I've done, look at me, I'm so clever. He wasn't at all clever.
Our understanding and the understanding of the judge was he was pleading guilty to all 4 murders. It was quite a bizarre event, because when he was arraigned before the judge and the clerk of the court put the charges to him, he pleaded not guilty to everything, which took everybody by surprise, including his own barristers.
The hearing was adjourned whilst his defence team attempted to find out the reasoning behind the last-minute change in plea. Eventually, Arkwright returned to the court on the understanding that he was permitted to read a poem that he'd written.
There's a very clear reason why he does this, because he's enjoying the attention, he's enjoying the notoriety, and a poem is something that's quite unique. It's something that is quite unusual. He knows that this is something that the media will pick up on, something that he will be remembered by.
It wasn't really a poem, it was just a rambling of words. And after a few minutes, the judge said, "No, I think we've had enough, and we'll stop the trial there. How do you plead to these charges?" And he pleaded to the 3 charges, murder, against Raymond Ford, Marcus Law and Stanislav Kodakas, and not guilty to the murder of Elsa Conradite.
The judge ordered Elsa's killing to remain on file, and on the 12th of July 1989, Arkwright was sentenced for the other 3 murders.
The judge describes him as an evil fantasist and calls the crimes grotesque sadism. It's impossible not to agree with him. He sentences Arkwright to life with a minimum term of 25 years.
In 1990, his case was reviewed by the Home Secretary, who imposed a whole life tariff. Arkwright is the youngest person ever to have received this term in the UK and has been condemned to die in prison.
Life would mean life as far as he was concerned. And I think that that's a proper sentence. I don't think this is a safe man to ever allow out on the street again.
His goal was not just to kill and to destroy and to release all of the anger and rage he carried with him his whole life, but he wanted to be infamous.
I have to say that the discovery of both bodies really was probably the most horrific sight I've ever seen, and remains the worst injuries I've ever seen that a human can deliberately inflict upon another human.
Arkwright took exceptional pride in killing in the most grotesque way. To take someone's life is bad enough, but to destroy what remains of their body, either by eviscerating it, or by gouging the eyes out, or by stabbing it several hundred times. These are the acts of a man who clearly deserves to be called evil.
Arkwright grew up harbouring a vendetta against his own family. He cared only for himself and would do whatever he wanted to those he deemed less worthy. He was a habitual criminal who craved recognition, and by engaging in a killing spree fueled by rage and revenge, was determined to emerge as infamous. He slaughtered his grandparents before torturing and mutilating 2 vulnerable neighbours, making Anthony Arkwright one of the world's most evil killers. In August 1981, 91-year-old Henry Walsh was held up at knife point in his small hardware store at Ormskirk, Lancashire, in England. The elderly shopkeeper refused to yield to his 18-year-old assailant. He would pay with his life in the most horrific way.
Obviously threatened him with a knife 2 or 3 times. You could see minor marks in his clothing. And then he just pushed it through his chest. And he's actually hanging on it on the door.
The perpetrator was Andrew Dawson, a known local thief who'd suddenly matured into a vicious murderer. He would spend the next 17 years behind bars, but that did nothing to dull his killer instinct.
Almost as inevitably as night follows day, Dawson was going to kill again. It was only a question of when.
Almost 30 years after his first killing, Dawson was a free man with murder on his mind. In 2010, police in Derby would discover 2 of Dawson's neighbours dead, but the convicted killer was nowhere to be found.
This guy kept me awake at night because you just had this feeling that you had to get the evidence, you had to put him away because he was an absolute danger to anybody in society.
Andrew Dawson had proved himself to be one of the world's most evil killers. In July 2011, Andrew Dawson pleaded guilty to the double murder of 2 of his neighbours and was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. It was the end of the road for the 48-year-old killer who chillingly christened himself the Angel of Mercy. Dawson was no stranger to prison. He'd already served time for murdering a popular shopkeeper in his hometown of Ormskirk in 1981, when he was just 18. Local journalist Clifford Birchall covered the story of the brutal murder in the unassuming town.
Ormskirk in the 80s was just a small country Lancashire town. It had a market that was on the streets twice a week, came alive on those days. It's a small, friendly place. Everybody seemed to know everybody. It was just an ordinary place, just nothing exciting happened very often.
That was all to change in August 1981, when 18-year-old Andrew Dawson entered a small hardware shop owned by popular pensioner Henry Walsh.
From what we learned from the evidence, he'd just gone in, he'd been looking for money, and he thought that Mr. Walsh would be a soft touch. He was, 91 years old. He wouldn't put up much of a fight. He would, do as he was told. But he turned out to have more spirit than Andrew Dawson thought he had. He refused to say where his money was. He refused to help him sort of trying to get him out of the shop, and in the end he paid for it with his life.
After serving 17 years for the crime, Dawson was released in 1999 and settled down in Derby with a wife and 2 children. But just over a decade later, the killer found himself living alone in a flat, and his lust for murder returned. Former detective Paul Callum investigated the killing of 2 of Dawson's neighbours in 2010.
The people that lived in this block of flats and his victims were vulnerable for some reason. Either they're older and they've got ill health, or alcohol problems and this sort of thing. And I think Dawson knew that, and he picked on vulnerable people because he knew that he could overpower them and he knew he could control them.
This killer's story begins in the market town of Ormskirk in Lancashire, in the north of England.
Dawson was born in 1962 and he was one of 6 children. The family were quite impoverished, they didn't have a lot of money, so I think times were pretty tough. He did have a very strict and domineering father, but that's nothing out of the ordinary, and his relationship with his mother doesn't seem to have flagged up any concerns either. So his family life wasn't particularly out of the ordinary.
But even from a young age, Dawson displayed signs that he was in for a life of crime.
He grows up in straitened circumstances in Ormskirk. A boy who wants whatever he wants whenever he wants to get it. When he's 6 or 7, he sees a little girl with money, pennies, literally, and steals them because he can, because he feels he can get away with it, because it doesn't matter.
He had a very acute sense of entitlement. If he wanted something, he would just literally go and take it. There were no moral or ethical boundaries there whatsoever. And I don't think that behaviour was ever really challenged. There were never really any serious consequences for that, and if there were, he didn't care. So this was somebody who was psychologically not quite normal.
In my view, Dawson was a sociopath from a very, very early age. He did not know responsibility, he did not know moral values, he did not know conscience, he did not know forgiveness, he did not know saying sorry. Grab it. I'm gonna take it. It's mine. I want it.
The majority of individuals who commit juvenile crime, petty or otherwise, usually turn themselves around as they mature out of it. The younger someone is when they begin their criminal behavior, the worse the prognosis is, the worse the outcome is. And so when you look at Dawson's background, what stands out to me from a distance is he was involved in crime right from the beginning. He was a problem child right from the start.
As Dawson matured, so did his crimes.
As a teenager, Dawson engaged in property crime. He committed a range of petty thefts, and the victims he would target would be elderly people. And I think he was quite aware of the vulnerability of the elderly, of the fact that they might keep money in their houses or their workplaces.
The burgeoning criminal was soon on the radar of the local authorities.
Andrew Dawson had come to the attention of the police in the past through just petty theft. He was known to them. I don't think they thought he was one of the great criminals of the town, but he was just perhaps more a nuisance than anything else.
There appeared to be nothing obvious in Dawson's young life that justified his criminality.
He had 5 siblings. They're not all committing crimes and killing people. No, it was Dawson. He's the only one. He grew up in the same family with them. The parents treated them, generally speaking, the same according to all the other family members. No, it was Dawson. It's within him. It wasn't an event that happened that created him. It's who he was.
I think there was very much a sense of competition between Dawson and his siblings. There's always that vying for attention, and there are 6 of them. So I think that they're always trying to outdo each other. And that's the case in many large families. But I think Dawson took it a little bit further than most. He had a significantly antagonistic relationship with his brother. He stole money from his brother.
It was the final straw. Dawson's brother reported him to the police, and the young criminal was arrested and charged with theft.
It was enough to have him sent to Borstal for about 6 months. And then sort of when he was released, he came back to Ormskirk, and obviously, hadn't really learnt from his ways. He just carried on as he had before.
Somebody like Dawson and other extraordinary offenders, who particularly those who commit multiple crimes, they see the world differently than the average person. They function in a different sphere. And so where punishment may help somebody straighten themselves out and get on the right track, for somebody like Dawson, it has no effect at all. It just serves as an irritant for him just makes him angry because he wants to do what he wants to do. That's who he is.
By the age of 18, Andrew Dawson was already a veteran thief, and his time in the youth prison nicknamed Borstal had not curbed his criminal ways. But in August 1981, his life of petty crime would take an even darker turn.
Henry Walsh had been a shopkeeper in the town for a long time. He was an ironmonger. His shop didn't carry a lot of stock, but it was stuff he couldn't find anywhere else. It was sort of a time warp in some ways. He was just a lovable old character.
At some point late on Thursday the 13th of August, Andrew Dawson entered Henry Walsh's shop. By the following morning, locals were concerned for the whereabouts of the 91-year-old.
Mr. Walsh hadn't been seen on the Friday, which was unusual, and somebody was going past noticed that two big gates which guarded the alley to the rear of the premises, they hadn't been closed all night, and his back door was open, which was unusual.
The passer-by dialed 999, and in a matter of moments, Detective Jim Kay arrived at the scene.
I was driving through the town, and the call came over the radio that this back door of the shop was open, and there was no sign of the shopkeeper. So I just turned around the corner. It was a matter of 20 yards, and went into the shop with another officer who arrived. He arrived and I said, just follow me in. You're walking through expecting to find the old man somewhere, maybe it collapsed. And to see this man hung on the door is a little bit frightening.
91-year-old Henry Walsh had been hung from coat hooks on the back of a door, tortured and then brutally stabbed to death with a carving knife. It wouldn't be long before news of the beloved elderly man found viciously murdered in his own hardware store got out. It would send shockwaves across the quiet town of Ormskirk, England.
I was in Moore Street, which is one of the main shopping streets, and about 250 yards away at the other end of Moore Street, I could see some unusual police activity. I could see a policeman standing where a policeman wouldn't normally stand, and he wasn't moving, so he was obviously guarding something, so I just acted on my reporter's instinct that something was wrong. So I sort of got there and sort of made some inquiries and ascertained that there had been a suspicious death, and it was Mr. Walsh, so I arranged for a photographer to come out and take a picture that we used in the paper of the police on the scene outside the shop.
Henry Walsh was a nice man. You know, one who I spoke to every time I passed. He would come to the door and say, good afternoon, good morning, and a very pleasant old man.
He was just a really lovable person, and you just couldn't imagine anybody who would have it in them to kill him, to be honest.
News of the 91-year-old's horrific death began reaching the locals. The nature of the crime was unthinkable.
He'd been stabbed with a knife, been stabbed in the chest several times, but he'd also been hung up at the back of a door on some coat hooks, and the last wound, the knife had gone straight through him and embedded itself in the back of the door. It also tied a ligature around his neck, presumably as a way to try and force some information out of him.
The police didn't know it yet, but the killer was an 18-year-old thief named Andrew Dawson, who had seemingly revelled in his first murder.
Dawson didn't just simply kill Henry Walsh. He made this victim suffer. He stabbed him multiple times. Some of the wounds were quite shallow, which is indicative of a torture, of saying, actually, I have power over you, I am in control, and enjoying the reaction of his victim to that. And he hung Henry up on the back of a door. So he's displaying his victim. He's saying, hey, everybody, look at what I've done. Look at what I can accomplish.
You have to ask yourself, what is it that provokes an 18-year-old to kill him, to repeatedly stab him, to pose him, and to leave him? There is something very, very depraved about that. There is something monstrous.
I don't see him targeting a truck driver, a 25-year-old truck driver out there. Well, why isn't he targeting that guy? That guy could have money too. He just made his deliveries. No. Dawson's way too smart for that. He targets somebody old and weak and vulnerable that he knows he can get over on. That's who Dawson is.
Dawson had killed a man 73 years his senior for nothing more than the day's takings from the till and the 91-year-old's pension book.
When police conducted a search of the house later on, they found out that Mr. Walsh did what most old people in those days did. He'd hidden money in and around rooms in the house, and I think they collected about £1,800 in cash, which was, quite a lot of money in those days. But I think Andrew Dawson had tried to get him to say where it was, but he'd refused, which I think perhaps accounts for the ferocity of his attack in the end.
He'd be frightened to death. He was a very timid old man. Not the type of man who'd look for trouble or get involved in trouble. He's only picked on because he was an old man. He wouldn't fight back. I wouldn't have thought.
After taking the life of another man for the very first time, Dawson didn't panic or attempt to flee Ormskirk. Instead, the cocky 18-year-old flaunted his newly acquired riches.
Now, everybody knows he's got no money. And he goes to a pub, the local pub, where he's seen, all of a sudden, feeding lots of coins into the fruit machine. Well, that's rather odd, rather strange. They're immediately going to say, where did you get the money from? It is unbelievably foolish.
He was somebody who was perpetually broke, so this was something that was rather unusual, and that the police eventually catch up with him. And it emerged that Dawson had actually cashed in Henry's pension book for £50 in the days following the murder.
Once Andrew Dawson was arrested, people, in some ways they weren't surprised because they knew he did have a reputation, but I think they were shocked that he could have done such a savage act.
At Preston Crown Court on the 10th of March 1982, Andrew Dawson pleaded guilty to the murder of Henry Walsh. He had told police that he panicked after the 91-year-old had recognised him. In a statement, Dawson said, "I am sorry for what I have done. I had no intention to cause anybody any harm. I wish it was me and not him."
The judge at the Crown Court gave credence to Andrew Dawson's guilty plea, and also the fact that he seemed remorseful to some extent. He was said to have told the police, I wish it had been me, not him. So the judge did give credence and mentioned this when she was passing sentence.
I'm not convinced by this whatsoever. We've got to remember that this was a young man who'd done a stint in Borstal. He was quite familiar with the types of things that he needed to say to get sympathy, to get attention, and to secure the best outcome for himself.
Dawson, aged just 19 years old, was jailed for life. He had graduated from Borstal to prison, adding murder to his rap sheet.
The mood after a murder trial, it's not exactly one where you say people were glad that a sentence had been carried out, but I think more one of relief that justice had been seen to be done, and the fact that the right thing had happened and people were now happy and they were content that the wrongdoing had been punished.
Dawson spent the next 17 years of his life behind bars, but during his time inside, he was no shrinking violet. He reportedly commented on serial killers Peter Sutcliffe and Dennis Nielsen, labelling them as wimps and claiming to be a better man.
When he was in prison, he was comparing himself to other notorious offenders. That's a bad sign. Anytime an offender wants to compare himself to other notorious killers, that's a huge red flag. A sign of rehabilitation is you want to put that part of your life away. You want to show how you're different than other people, not how that you're more extraordinary than some of these notorious people. That's a huge red flag.
In early 1999, Andrew Dawson was deemed ready for release from Sudbury Prison in Derbyshire. Still just 36 years old, it was a chance for him to start a new life.
After his release from prison, Andrew Dawson appeared to have turned over a new leaf. He'd moved to a different area, Derby. He'd met a woman, he'd settled down with her, and they had 2 children together. And from the outside, he appears to be a regular guy. But this was not to last, because Andrew Dawson is a person who is prone to boredom. He has that need for stimulation. He has that hedonistic streak to him. So he starts drinking, and that leads to the breakdown of his marriage.
He's matured now, he's older, maybe he's a different person. But it wasn't long before Dawson reverted to who he was.
Over the next decade, Dawson would continually breach the conditions of his release.
In that period between his divorce in 2003 and 2010, Dawson bumps into the law and is returned to prison on a regular basis 3 times. He's drunk and disorderly, he's violent. He isn't in any kind of control, and he's constantly, therefore, because he's out on license for the original life sentence, straight back to jail. Almost as inevitably as night follows day, Dawson was going to kill again. It was only a question of when.
By July 2010, Andrew Dawson was estranged from his wife with limited access to his children. He lived alone in a 1-bedroom flat on Waterford Drive just outside of Derby. Former detective Paul Callum worked on the investigation into the sudden death of one of Dawson's neighbours, 66-year-old John David Matthews.
The initial police incident came in at 7 p.m. on the Sunday the 25th of July. Mr. Matthews worked at a local restaurant, and staff at the restaurant had been worried that he'd not turned up for work in the previous week or so. And police officers were called to the flat, and they forced entry, and they found Mr. Matthews' body in the bath downstairs. They looked at Mr. Matthews' body, and unfortunately, because they think he'd been there for a couple of weeks, there was quite a lot of decomposition. And at that time, the incident was recorded as potential suicide.
But the post-mortem told a different story.
Late in the afternoon of Wednesday the 28th of July, I had a phone call from the coroner's office to say that the local pathologist had started the post-mortem of Mr. Matthews, and that he said that there was what he believed were stab wounds.
It was clear this was not a suicide, it was in fact murder. The killer had done his best to cover up the murder.
What he'd done at the crime scene with Mr. Matthews is that after stabbing him, he'd redressed him. So he'd got rid of the shirt that had the stab wounds through it and put a shirt that didn't have any marks on it. He completely changed all his clothing and then put him into the bath. We started doing some early inquiries, and one of those was, what do we have on the electoral register? Who lives there? What intelligence do we have about the block of flats?
Detectives immediately singled out convicted killer Andrew Dawson as a potential suspect.
It very quickly became obvious that Andrew Dawson was going to be our suspect. He had convictions for murder, and he was on licence, and there was some history of a recent assault with somebody else at a previous flat that he lived at. So it was reasonably obvious that he was going to be our main focus quite early on. We wanted to secure the scene at Dawson's house, and then obviously our biggest priority was finding out where was Dawson right now.
Whilst detectives launched a manhunt, investigators forced entry into Dawson's flat.
The flat was completely empty, apart from a few items of clothing, but what was particularly interesting about Dawson's flat was it smelt of bleach, and it was very, very clean.
Andrew Dawson was nowhere to be found. He was on the run and presumed to be very dangerous.
We were extremely worried. We obviously knew that a murder had happened at some point before the Sunday the 25th, and looking at the decomposition, we think probably up to 2 weeks before that. So we had nearly a 3-week time period where we had no idea where Dawson had been.
John David Matthews, who was known as Dave, had actually been killed on the 10th of July, stabbed 18 times by his seemingly friendly neighbour, Andrew Dawson, who often popped over to use the washing machine.
Dawson arrives at his door with the conventional excuse that he used many times in the block. Can I use your washing machine because mine's broken? Dave lets him in, not suspecting anything. Imagine what must have gone through Dave Matthews' mind. It would have been indescribable, terrifying, reduced him to absolute fear in an instant, and yet there was nothing he could do. Nothing he could do to protect himself against a man who'd come there to kill him, and to kill him for reasons entirely of his own. This was not a motive of greed. This was a motive of the desire to kill.
After Dawson had killed David and left his body in the bath, he actually left the flat because this was the day when he was looking after his children, and he took them out for the day as if nothing had ever happened, and he returned the next day and cleaned up the crime scene and got rid of the blood. Now, for somebody to be able to do this, to be able to function as normal after committing a murder, is something that is very, very rare. I've met a lot of people convicted of murder, and their behaviour in the aftermath is very rarely normal because they're so shocked at the enormity of what they've done that they're unable to function with any degree of normality.
The crime had affected the whole community. As the search for the convicted killer continued, detectives questioned the other neighbours at Waterford Drive. One neighbour even told a story to police of how the killer had been involved in an altercation in his flat.
A resident started telling the investigating officer that had sat down with him to take his statement about the relationship with Dawson, and that they used to walk in each other's flats and this sort of thing.
The neighbour went on to describe an incident which had occurred just days before. After inviting Dawson in for a drink, he caught him rifling through his drawers. The neighbour confronted him and Dawson turned nasty.
He was grabbed from behind with an arm around his neck, and he felt something in his sort of lower abdomen. He'd sort of thrown Dawson off. Dawson made light of it and said he was just mucking around and this sort of thing. And again, at the time, he didn't particularly think anything of this, but we now know when you listen to the account and you know what Dawson was capable of, that it was likely that he was going to be his first victim.
I think that's only further evidence of the fact that in this small block in Chaddeston, not a lot of flats, that Dawson was by now out of control, completely and utterly out of control. He would attack anyone, driven by his own desire to kill.
On the morning of the 30th of July, detectives received news that Dawson had been spotted in Whitehaven, Cumbria, over 200 miles away from Derby. While local police began to search for the killer, investigations were continuing at the flats. Detectives had accounted for all of Dawson's neighbours, apart from one, 58-year-old Paul Hancock.
So at about 7:30, 8 o'clock, while I was doing the briefing, we got one of the detective sergeants stood at the back of the room and was waving at me, and she came across and whispered to me and said they found another body, and that the officers that were doing the house-to-house inquiries had forced entry to Mr. Hancock's flat and had found him, and he'd also been murdered. We finished the briefing and it started again, and this is when you started to really feel concerned that what had Dawson been doing in that 3-week period that we couldn't account for, and had he killed anybody else?
How many more bodies might turn up at Waterford Drive? It was a frightening thought for the investigators, and they soon had information that revealed the killer had been in the building on the very same day the body of Dave Matthews was discovered.
It turns out on the Sunday afternoon, the call came in about Mr. Matthews. The police had arrived at the flat, and this came out with subsequent inquiries, but it turned out that Dawson was actually upstairs in Hancock's flat when the police arrived. Now, it's possible that he had just committed the murder at that point, or he may have committed the murder over the previous few days and he was there starting to clean up, but we will never really know. But what we do know is that Dawson was in Mr. Hancock's flat when the police arrived. He came downstairs, he spoke to one of the special constables that was there, and he was asked had he seen Mr. Matthews, and he spoke to the police and said that, oh no, he doesn't know him very well, he hasn't seen very much of him. And we then know that within about 10 minutes he'd packed his bag, he'd ordered a taxi, and he'd left the house and had gone to the train station.
Unbeknownst to the police, they had stood face to face with the killer. Since that moment, Andrew Dawson had been on the run for 5 days. But now local police in Whitehaven had located him and were ready to make an arrest.
A uniformed constable comes across Andrew Dawson sleeping on a bench on the seafront in Whitehaven. He might almost have had a sign on his chest saying, "I'm Andrew Dawson and you really want to look at me because I killed 2 people in Derby."
But the police had to proceed with care. They were dealing with a serial killer. Armed with 7 knives in his backpack, Dawson had no intention of giving himself up.
Dawson appeared to want the police to shoot him. He wanted to go down in a blaze of glory and basically occupy a lot of headlines. There's a real kind of dramatic element to this perpetrator. And shortly after he was arrested, he jumped into the sea and he started to swim away. And it really is quite incredible, the behaviour of this man. He soon realised, actually, this probably isn't a good idea, I'm not getting anywhere, and then swam back to shore where the police caught up with him again. It's an attempt at being dramatic. It's an attempt at trying to create this kind of feared persona, but it's one that always falls flat on its face for Dawson.
Dawson is tasered rather than shot. I'm sure he was very upset by that. I'm sure he would much rather that armed response unit had turned up and given him the glory that he wanted.
With Dawson safely in custody, investigators could begin to delve deeper into the 47-year-old killer. After his dramatic arrest in Whitehaven, Cumbria, he'd been brought back down to Derbyshire to be questioned on suspicion of the murders of his neighbours, Dave Matthews and Paul Hancock. The bodies of both victims had been bathed in bleach to hide any forensic evidence. Detectives would have to use all their skills to prove that Andrew Dawson had killed again.
In terms of an investigation, normally you have sort of 36 hours of real urgent work to do because you have to either have to get enough evidence to charge somebody or you have to release them. Because he was on parole and because of the nature of this, actually from an investigator's point of view, it made the job a little bit easier because we could recall him to prison and actually we had a lot of time to make sure that we could get the evidence together and get the case together, which was just as well because despite it feeling like it was obviously him, you've got to get the evidence to prove that. And forensically, it was very, very challenging.
On the same day of Dawson's arrest, police had discovered the body of 58-year-old Paul Hancock. Just like his neighbour Dave Matthews, Paul had been found stabbed to death in his own bathtub.
With Mr. Matthews, the flat had been cleaned. There was a lot of bleach poured into the bath. It had clearly been tidied up. And with Mr. Hancock's, it was very dishevelled. It had been very rushed. There was clothing in the bath, there was weapons in the bath, there was all sorts of bits of gloves, marigold gloves and this sort of thing. All the drawers had been through the house and we know that money was stolen and various other items. And apart from the fact that there was bodies in the bath and had been stabbed, the two scenes were totally different.
It's believed that Dawson was still cleaning up the crime scene when the police had discovered the body of Dave Matthews across the hall. Dawson likely panicked and threw his clothes into the bath of bleach to kill any forensic evidence.
On the yellow trousers that he was wearing, there was a slash mark on the right-hand side, on the right leg. Dawson also had an injury to his right leg, and it's impossible to actually match that to the injury, but again, it's very likely that he was wearing those trousers when he committed the murder. So he's very forensically aware, so I think he had a system, he had a type of clothing that he wore to make sure that he doesn't get contaminated with blood, and then he went and commits the murders, and then he bleaches them and gets rid of any evidence.
Bleach indicates forensic awareness. Bleach is one of those things that wipes up a great deal of forensic evidence. Dawson's been a career criminal. He's been in prison his entire life. He knows what bleach does. He was in the juvenile center, but he also went to state prison. That's like graduate school for crime. All the criminals do all day is talk about their crimes and how they got caught and this and that and how to avoid law enforcement. So the fact that he used bleach doesn't surprise me at all. It just reflects what he learned in prison and how to try to avoid detection.
With Dawson being held in custody indefinitely, it gave detectives more time to study the crime scene at Dave Matthews' flat.
When we first searched Mr. Matthews' house, there was a few items that we didn't really understand. One of them was a rose that was on the pillow in Mr. Matthews' bedroom, and it was just an old red rose. The other thing was, when we searched Dawson's flat, there was a blank notepad, but you could see indentations on it.
This suggested that a note had been written on the sheet of paper above. If experts could decipher the faint indentations, it could be a huge clue.
About 3 weeks after that inquiry had been sent off, I got a phone call from our forensic team, really excited. And they said, they were saying, "Boss, this is amazing, this is fantastic. We've got a confession." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And it turned out that he'd written a letter to the police. And it was to the head of homicide, it said. And he wrote this poem, very badly spelled, but the poem talked about in a bath in Waterford Drive, there lies a man, and he talked about, if in 2 weeks' time you don't know about it, I will come and report it to the police. And he talked about the rose being the nice touch, and he signed it, the Angel of Mercy. Really, really chilling, but very, very important key bit of evidence.
Dawson had signed the note with a chilling moniker.
The confession letter that police had come across had been signed the Angel of Mercy, and I think this is really testament to Andrew Dawson's narcissism. He wanted a brand, he wanted an identity, he wanted infamy, and I think this was very much part of that. He wants that recognition for the things that he's done.
He's pretending to be significant. He's not. He's an insignificant, horrid, horrible, depraved, monstrous killer, but not in his mind.
As investigations continued, more evidence was uncovered at Dave Matthews' flat.
In Mr. Matthews' house, there was very, very little forensic evidence in there, in terms of fingerprints, DNA, and this sort of thing. He had destroyed most of the evidence, but we found a marigold glove in the bath that had the thumb missing on it. And part of the forensic strategy was to find this piece of rubber from the thumb.
Paul knew that finding the tip of the glove may finally yield some forensic evidence.
So the whole house was completely emptied. We spent weeks there, meticulously going through everything in the lounge, and the scenes of crime team found the tip of the marigold glove. And we think that it probably got caught in a drawer while he was stealing property from the flat, and it had snapped off. And in this small piece of the thumb, and it was the tiny piece of the thumb there, they managed to recover some DNA, which proved that it was Andrew Dawson, which was a very, very significant piece of evidence because forensically we had very, very little. There was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but little forensic evidence.
In total, 5,000 items were seized from the flats at Waterford Drive. However, only one of these provided the conclusive forensic evidence investigators needed. This new discovery undoubtedly connected Dawson with the murder of Paul Hancock. In interviews with investigators, Andrew Dawson initially confessed to both murders.
He talked about Mr. Matthews being a nice man. He talked about how he didn't really want to kill him, but he just felt that he had to, and he had an urge to do it. And this was what's particularly chilling and very frightening about Mr. Dawson. There didn't seem to be any particular motive other than a desire to kill somebody. So in that respect, you tell me someone's mental state, that's quite worrying. Certainly, I dealt with a lot of murder inquiries for all sorts of different reasons. But to have somebody that said they just had an urge to do it is very, very frightening.
By the time of his court hearing in July 2011, Dawson had changed his story, denying the murders and pleading not guilty. But he didn't hide behind his lies for long.
You saw it in court. He was very, very impatient. He didn't like to wait around. He liked a very impetuous sort of character. For example, at court, he pleaded not guilty, and after a couple of hours, he looked like he got bored, and he had a word with his solicitor and just said, "Oh, I can't be bothered. I'll plead guilty," and that was the court case. And that was kind of the way I think he was.
This is a tactic that we see with a lot of offenders like Dawson. They enjoy playing with people, they enjoy manipulating people, they enjoy having everybody running around, sorting things out, and then they chuck a grenade in and cause chaos. And I think that's exactly what he was doing here.
In total, Andrew Dawson stabbed Dave Matthews 18 times and Paul Hancock 22 times. He had received a fairly lenient sentence after his first murder in Ormskirk in 1981. But there would be no similar result for him this time.
The judge, Mrs. Justice Dobbs, gave Dawson a whole life tariff. Life will mean life in your case. She told Dawson in sentencing, these were premeditated and planned, brutal killings. Each had the misfortune of being your neighbour who had no chance.
Relief, I think, more than anything. But there wasn't, there's no particular reason to sort of celebrate or anything like that. It's just, really sad for the victims of the family. These were both victims were just, regular people that were trying to live their life and hadn't particularly upset anybody. In fact, both have been described as very pleasant people that just sort of kept themselves to themselves. So very, very sad.
Andrew Dawson remains in prison and will never be released. Some experts believe that he was never rehabilitated after his first murder conviction and should never have been in a position to be able to kill 2 more innocent victims.
For me, what makes this case exceptional is the failure to realise how serious the first murder was. It was interpreted as a homicide during the course of a robbery, but actually it was much, much worse than that. This individual had been tortured, essentially. The time that the perpetrator had spent with the victim was quite significant, and the perpetrator was only 18 years old. So I think this was a massive red flag for further potential violence, and even though he was convicted of murder, there was not enough work done to address what led to that.
I think that there is a case that sort of some people are so dangerous that they can't be allowed out again, out of prison. It seems a harsh thing to condemn somebody to die in prison, but sort of I think some people, never learn and never alter. I think it's one of those things that sort of sometimes you have to do it. And this is, probably one of those cases.
Dawson was a selfish killer who had no regard for his victims. The only reason he's ever given for his horrific crimes is that he had an urge to kill.
When we look at the crimes of Andrew Dawson, they are so horrendous that many people say this could only be the workings of a madman. But unfortunately, they're not. This is an individual who knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that what they were doing was wrong, and they carried on doing it anyway.
It's conventional to talk about serial killers as having a trigger. Sometimes it's in their childhood, sometimes it's a moment in their adolescence. I don't believe there was such a trigger to Andrew Dawson. I think there was something in him from the very beginning that led him to commit these heinous crimes.
I dealt with a lot of suspicious deaths and a lot of murder inquiries. There weren't many that kept me awake at night. This guy kept me awake at night because you just had this feeling that you had to get the evidence. You had to put him away because he was an absolute danger to anybody in society. I think this idea that you can suddenly get an urge to kill someone clearly makes you extremely dangerous, doesn't it?
Dawson is a killer who murdered innocent people for his own depraved enjoyment. He may have started out as a petty thief, but that was an unlawful livelihood that didn't satiate his urges. He needed something more to satisfy his twisted mind. His lust for murder and the pleasure he gets from it are what makes Andrew Dawson one of the world's most evil killers.